Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight's feature is called 7 Creepiest Hidden Cemeteries Unearthed During Construction. Across the United States, progress has dug deeper than it should have. Foundations poured over forgotten soil, neighborhoods raised on land that was already claimed by the dead, under parking lots, schools, and highways. Entire graveyards have been rediscovered. Wooden coffins splintered by backhoes, nameplates surfacing in the light after a century of silence. These aren't urban legends. They're records, each tied to real coordinates, real names, and real workers who wish they'd never been on shift that day. Some walked away. Some didn't sleep again. In this episode, we'll uncover 7 of the most unsettling discoveries ever made when modern America collided with its buried past. From churchyards paved over for convenience, to luxury homes standing on ground that still whispers at night. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of you listen and disappear. Don't be one of them. Step into the dark with me. Subscribe now, because what you'll hear tonight was never meant to be unearthed. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what hour of the night is it there? And if your town hides a cemetery that locals avoid after sunset, I want to know its name, because when the world sleeps and the soil finally settles, some things beneath it do not rest. Kill the lights. Silence the world. Take a slow breath, and let us begin. The first sound was a hollow bounce where there shouldn't have been one. One clean thump, then a second, then the soft roll of something finding a seam in concrete. The gym had already been torn down. All that remained on the grounds were the sodium lamps, the chain-link perimeter, and the square of earth they'd declared a cemetery again. I stood at the gate with a mag light and the brass key the city gave me, and I told myself it was a palm frond in the wind. My name is Nate, 36, night security for the recovery crew. I'm on the grounds between dusk and dawn at what used to be the East Side High School. It's Tampa, humid by default, and the old gym floor sat atop what we now know was an erased cemetery. Workers peeled up the maple boards and found coffin wood where joists should be. The school closed the building, a fence went up, and they hired us to protect the site while archaeologists documented and clergy arranged reburials. I'm writing this because sleeping got hard after what happened last week, when the bell rope moved and the map didn't match the ground. The first shift felt ordinary. Keys, radio, a paper map with sections marked A through H, and a ledger so the city can prove who came and went. I have a habit I picked up from my grandfather's grave visits. I count my steps when I'm nervous. 16 paces from the gate to the temporary memorial tent, 12 more to the maintenance shed, 4 from the shed to the pallet of granite markers with blue tape still on them. Counting keeps the mind in a box. The memorial tent stood where the free throw line used to be. Someone had chalked it faintly on the concrete before demo. The archaeologists left the line because it helped them orient photographs. A ghost of a court over a court of the dead. Under the tent, a brass handbell hung from a length of rope. Deacon Ellison set it there the first day and asked us to give it a quick tug at midnight during the prayer for the unclaimed. It wasn't connected to anything but habit. I did my circuit. Fence taut, gate chain locked, generator checked. We keep a small one for the LED work lights in the tent. And a look into the excavation itself. It wasn't a hole so much as a step-down rectangle with chalked grids and survey flags. The soil layers showed like cake. Modern fill, then lighter sand, then darker clay, then the coffin prints with collapsed lids. They logged everything. Nail types, wood species, nameplate screws if they found them. 24 coffins had been there. Most of the human remains were in poor condition because of the humidity. The archaeologists spoke carefully. Individuals, interments, and their hands were gentle. At about 11:20 p.m., I heard the bounce again. 2 thumps this time closer. It seemed to come from under the tent. I walked in, light catching dust in the beam. No ball, no kid sneaking past the fence. The generator ticked once as it cooled. The bell rope hung still, just a frayed tail in the humidity. That's when the smell reached me, faint but sharp like pennies in the mouth. The archaeologists called it earth metal. I'd smelled it during the day when they opened coffin lines and you got air that hadn't moved in a century. At night, it shouldn't have been there. There were no open units, and they backfilled each evening with clean sand. I clicked the mag light off and listened. Nothing but the wash of distant traffic on Hillsborough, and a lone owl deciding he didn't care for human schedules. The curiosity didn't resolve. I tried to write it off as a neighbor's basketball drifting sound over the fences, or a branch losing its patience. At 11:58, I walked over and tugged the bell once because I'd promised I would. The tone came back small and bright, and for a breath afterward I swear I heard the tiniest answering knock under the concrete. One tap, then the suggestion of a roll. I told no one. You learn what not to share if you want to keep a night job. I wasn't alone on site for long. Nights 3 and 4. A school custodian named Marisol Alvarez came by with coffee on her break and stood by the chain link talking softly about her father's grave back in Ybor. She hummed under her breath. Old boleros I didn't know. And she asked if I minded if she left a coin under the tent for the unnamed. I said the clerics preferred flowers, but a coin was fine if she set it on the table. She set a quarter down and tapped it once with a fingernail. The sound bounced around the tent like it had been waiting. Smells like rain, Marisol said, sniffing. Or pennies. She noticed the smell too. The 5th night brought the first wrong thing I could write down. I keep a map in my pocket with the locations they've confirmed, each plot labeled with a temporary tag. In the corner of Section D there should have been nothing. The map showed a blank rectangle where the gym storage closet had sat. But there, along the chalk line, a faint rectangle of damp soil darkened the sand as if something underneath exhaled. No rain had fallen. My boot prints crunched dry. The dampness made a straight line to the memorial tent where the free throw line had been. I followed the dark seam with the light and found it ended under the bell rope. I called Deacon Ellison. She's fine at midnight. One of those clergy who seem to wake before the phone rings. Don't go down there, she said, calm the way pastors get after dozens of hospital visits. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Wait by the gate. I thought everything's closed up, I said. It is, she said. Wait there. I stood by the gate and counted the minutes by crunching gravel between my fingers. Officer Harlan from the night shift slid his sedan into the lot and leaned on the hood like this was any other call. He's the kind who clips his radio low on his belt and keeps his hands tucked warm in his sleeves. Vandals? He asked. Damp soil where it shouldn't be, I said. Saying it out loud sounded dumb. He nodded, which was generous. We'll walk at once when the deacon arrives. She arrived with keys, the ring sounding like watered brass when she jogged across the lot. We walked to the tent. The damp line had grown wider. It had the shape of something you learn to recognize. The faint outline of a box wider at the shoulders, narrower at the feet, pressing up. The nameplate screw of a coffin sometimes leaves a green circle in the sand. I saw one near the tent leg. No coffin, just the green memory of a screw. Officer Harlan's voice went careful. You want us to call the archaeologists? They'll be here in the morning, Deacon Ellison said. We're not disturbing anything tonight. She asked me to ring the bell. I did once. The sound rang out thin and civilized. After it faded, we all heard it, that hollow bounce. One then another. Not loud, not near. It sounded like it came from under where the bleachers had once been, which now was Section D, which the map called blank. Could be pipes, Harlan said. No pipes that bounced, the deacon said, but she kept her voice neutral. We waited. The smell strengthened, that iron tongue tang, moving as if carried by a draft from the earth. Finally, we backed out of the tent together and stood under the sodium lamp. A moth ticked the lens. Here's what we'll do, the deacon said. No dissents. Close the tent. Lock the gate. Pray if you do. I'll call Dr. Klein to bring the ground-penetrating. A third bounce cut her off. This one carried a soft echo like a palm had found an old board. Radar, she finished and looked at me. Nate, you still have the plot maps from the gym before demo? In the shed, I said. Bring them here, she said. Let's not lose our place. I jogged to the maintenance shed, the small prefab box we assembled by the fence. It smelled like fuel and citrus cleaner. Gomez, the crewman with square boot prints, had left the steel blower leaning against the wall, and the Fisker's loppers hung in their hooks. On the shelf sat the cardboard tube of maps. As I pulled it down, the generator outside ticked. Something rolled against the baseboard with a hollow plastic sound. A ball, I thought, with a small childish flare of dread. But it was only the empty water jug we keep for rinsing our hands, shifting from some vibration. The map inside the tube was the old gym layout. When I carried it back and rolled it out under the tent, the overlap snapped into place. The blank area in Section D matched the equipment closet in the old plans, But there was a note in pencil I hadn't seen. Someone had written "subfloor hatch" in tiny, neat letters. Who marked that? Harlan asked. Denise, Deacon Ellison said. The contract archaeologist. She chews cinnamon gum so fiercely you hear it before you see her. She said the closet had a hatch to access ventilation or electrical conduit, but we didn't find it during demo. They paved over multiple times. Look. She pointed to the chalk. If the hatch had been here, it would line up with this chalk seam. The damp rectangle lay neatly atop that seam. The bell rope brushed it when it swayed. False safety, I heard myself say. It sounded like something from one of the deacon's sermons, but I meant something simpler. We'd assumed the area was blank because the map said closet. The map had lied by omission. We did not open anything that night. We closed the tent flaps, added a second chain to the perimeter gate, and signed the ledger like nothing special had happened. The smell faded as easily as it had come, which somehow felt worse. Morning brought people to name. Dr. Klein arrived with the radar cart and a smile meant to disarm. He's the kind who gentles even a machine when he pushes it, the kind who rests the palm of his hand on metal before he wakes it. Denise showed up with her cinnamon halo. Mrs. Patel, who runs the flower stall on Armenia, delivered lilies wrapped too tight and scolded herself, loosening them with quick fingers. And Gomez walked a slow square around the tent before touching his boot heel to the damp seam, like a man checking the edge of a dream. They ran the radar. The screen showed what they call anomalies, pale shapes that might be voids. The strongest return formed a rectangle, a hatch, the hatch we hadn't found. Here's where the first curiosity gap finally closed and opened another. The hatch had to be opened to document the area, but doing it at noon with press around would start rumors before the dead were respected. They scheduled the opening for 10 p.m., after we closed the gate to the public. The deacon wanted a prayer. Dr. Klein wanted measurements. I wanted a clean night and an easy report. At 9:55 p.m., they gathered under the tent with headlamps and gloves. The air felt like a wrist pressed against your mouth. I had the Yale padlock key in my pocket, the ring warm against my leg. We moved the bell aside and set the mag lights in a row. Denise found the edge of the hatch by tapping with a nameplate screw she'd pocketed as a sample. You use what you have on 3, Dr. Klein said. Lift gently. We lifted the square and the earth metal smell came out like a held breath. No shock, no cinematic burst, just old air moving for the first time, and a line of condensation forming on the brass ring of the bell as if it were sweating. Inside the hatch, a short crawl space dropped into a low vault made of old brick. The vault stretched beneath where the bleachers had been. The LED work light showed a tidy corridor with brick niches along both sides. Not a burial vault in the usual sense. Just the kind of space used in the 1910s for utilities or storage, later co-opted for something else when the school went up. On the wall nearest us, scratched into old lime wash, were the faint numbers 1 through 10 repeated in rows. Lines marked off a rectangle painted with the ghost of a boundary line. Court, Gomez said softly, then bit off the last consonant like it offended him. Or a game played on any flat surface, Dr. Klein said. But he didn't sound certain. The deacon bowed her head and offered a short prayer for names we didn't know. She didn't ask for signs. That felt important. Who goes down? Denise asked. I will, I said. It wasn't bravado. The job description said assist as directed, and I counted. Counting keeps your feet where they need to be. I clipped a line to the ladder, slid into the crawl space, and ducked in. The first thing I noticed was the shift in sound. Outside, even at night, you have wind, a car somewhere, insects sawing the dark. Down there, the world pressed in. My breathing took on a metronome tick in my ears. The light showed dust like fog, drifting, then settling. The floor felt solid, old board laid on brick. I could see where someone had chalked a square long ago and how that square had been walked until the chalk polished the wood. Anything? Denise asked up top. Numbers on the wall, I said. And I hesitated. Something round at the far end. Describe it. I took 6 paces. Like a can. Or a jar. Leave it for now, Dr. Klein said. I squatted and played my light across the niches. Some held board ends, some held nothing. One held an old nail bucket with a handle bent into a frown. The coin Marisol had left under the tent had fallen from the table at some point and rolled in. It lay against the brick like a spent offering. I reached to slide it back closer to the hatch. The metal stung cold. There was another smell below the iron, the faint sweetness of floral preservative. Mrs. Patel's lilies giving themselves to the air in a way that didn't make sense down here. A movement brushed the hairs on my arm. Not wind exactly, but like someone had just walked past an air-made room. Then the bounce came. One clear thump behind me. I turned and swept the light. Nothing. Another thump, slower, as if something tested the floor. "Do you hear that?" I asked, trying for level. "We hear you," the deacon called. "What do you hear?" "Floor settling," I lied. Counting again, I moved toward the round object. It wasn't a can. It was a glass jar with a wire bail, cloudy with time. Inside it, a tethered string. The old practice of keeping a bell on a grave had a cousin in cities. Attaching a cord to a jar at night to check for movement, superstition more than procedure. Or so the stories say. The jar had residue on its lip where a wire would have been. The string had been cut. "Come up," Denise said. "We'll document that jar in the morning." "Copy," I said. I turned and my light grazed a scuffed patch of wood. In the dust were prints like the round kisses a ball leaves when it's dropped in the same place 100 times. No ball, no feet. Only the record of repetition. I reached the ladder and felt a small tug at my boot. Not hard, like a child testing a pant leg. I kicked gently and my heel brushed the glass jar. It clinked. The sound jumped along the brick like a note in a bottle. I came up and the deacon touched my elbow. "You're shaking," she said. It was a comment, not a rebuke. "We should seal it for tonight," Dr. Klein said. "We have documentation to prep." We set the hatch back. It settled with a low sound that, if you were sleeping and heard it through old wood, might have felt like a ball drawn slow, then dropped once. I set the Yale lock and wrote the time in the ledger. The night air felt grateful. "Good work," the deacon said. "Go take a breath." I walked the fence line. 16 to the tent. 12 to the shed. 4 to the markers. Counting fixed the world in place again. At the shed, I found Marisol outside the chain link with coffee in a paper cup. "You look like you saw something you can't say out loud," she said. She had a gift for skipping to the truth. "We found a hatch," I said.
"That was allowed."
"We'll finish it tomorrow." She hummed a few notes and glanced at the tent. "I left the coin in there like I told you. It wasn't on the table when I came by. I thought the wind, but there is no wind." "Found it in the vault," I said, which sounded ridiculous. "Vault," she repeated. "So it's a cemetery again, even if the sign says school." She slid the coffee between the chain links. "Don't stay alone in your head," she said. "My father used to say the dead are best behaved if you don't make them feel ignored." That felt like either good theology or good neighborliness. I went back to the tent. The bell rope hung where we'd left it. The lily scent was soft and human. I took one breath that didn't scrape my throat. Then the false hope failed. The bell rope twitched. Not from wind, not much. A small, deliberate tug, as if someone had remembered to ask for attention and used what they had. Once. Twice. 3 slow pulls. The rope fibers rasped against the yoke in modest protest. I didn't wring it back. The deacon would have. I did not. Morning came clenched. We documented the jar and the hatch. Press came whether we wanted them or not. They took photos of the tent and went away when the deacon made a gesture that felt like an embrace and a boundary at once. The crew mapped the niches and measured the chalked square. The city authorized a temporary columbarium wall to hold remains until reburial. The wall went up in a week, smooth stucco, neat brass tags, row C running waist high. On the night they finished the columbarium, the bounce returned with company. It came sooner, before 10, and in a pattern I couldn't explain with heat. A thump near the hatch, then near row C, then back under the tent as if something practiced arcs or memory instead of space. I stood with the mag light off and let my ears do more work than I liked. Under the sodium wash, everything looked underwater. I counted 5 breaths, 10, 15. The smell rose, cooled, faded. I did the one thing I hadn't done. I rang the bell 3 times slow. A pause, my mouth tasted like brass. When the tone died, the bounce came once more, this time from the columbarium wall itself. Hollow as if a finger flicked a niche cover from the inside. I walked over and traced row C with my hand. The brass tags were cold. Tag C07 had a fingerprint of condensation I couldn't place. The ledger we kept for temporary placements had no name for that niche yet. Empty officially. "Don't put your ear there," Gomez said behind me. I jumped because I hadn't heard him cross the gravel. "You don't want to give them a way in." "I thought you weren't superstitious," I said. He shrugged. "I believe in procedures, and in not inviting trouble with an ear." We called Dr. Klein and he gave us this. Structures change temperature at night, air expands and contracts, covers flex. The simple things are usually true. I wanted to believe him. Then I saw the coin Marisol had left tucked into the lip of the niche as if someone had tried to pay fare. We wrapped that night without incident on paper. The ledger shows I did one final patrol at 4:12 a.m. and wrote clear and signed my initials, which are uneven when I'm tired. 2 days later, Denise found her pencil note on the old gym plans. The tiny subfloor hatch had been written twice. The second time, the letters were neater than her hand and the graphite newer. She asked if anyone had handled the map. No one had. She laughed it off as a trick of light. I saw her chew cinnamon harder after that, jaw tight. The city moved quiet and fast with reinterments. In the late afternoon, small services gathered under the tent. 3 family members, a prayer, a hand to the soil. I stood well back. Names returned to the world where they could. For the unclaimed, we reserved row C. The deacon wrote a line in the ledger for each. Held in trust. On my last night before days off, the weather threatened rain and changed its mind. The air tasted of it anyway. I walked the perimeter, counting. The bell rope's fibers felt damp, a river held in rope. At 12:03 a.m., I heard the bounce again, softer now, as if coming from farther away or through more layers of settled dust. Thump near the hatch, thump near row C, thump under the tent. I followed in that order. Hatch sealed and padlocked. Row C still, brass cool. Tent quiet. The coin on the memorial table was gone. I bent to look for it and saw it in the soil, pressed edge on. Beside it, the tiniest round prints dusted in like the touch of a small sphere. I reached to pluck the coin from the soil and it came away clean, as if the dirt had handed it over. I set it back on the table and stood a long time, longer than my habits allowed, and waited for any change I could name. I do not have a tidy ending for you. There was no apparition, no concrete cracked, no grand headline. The jar remained a jar with a cut string. The hatch was photographed and sealed again. The school grounds will someday be a memorial garden, not a gym. We did what grown people do when we want to honor and to finish. But I will tell you about the morning after that last night. I came back off schedule with coffee and a bag of screws for a loose nameplate. Brass 632, the kind that won't eat through old metal. The sun was fresh and already mean. Marisol was there early, humming. The deacon had placed lilies in a vase that caught the sodium light residue on its rim. The coin lay quiet on the table. The ledger lay open to the previous night's line, my initials still uneven. And on row C at niche 07, a small smear of pollen arced downward like the ghost of a lazy dribble. No prints, no dust circles. Just that arc, yellow and delicate, from nothing to brass. Later, when we set a name in C07, we did it without theater. We tightened the screws. We wiped away the pollen. The tag took a fingerprint I won't forget. Mine, warmer than it had a right to be on an August morning. Sometimes at close, when the air goes still, the bell rope twitches once, as if someone remembers how signals worked and is practicing without urgency. When it does, I count to 3 and ring it back once, not as a conversation, but as manners. If I'm alone, I place a coin where it can be found, the way you leave water out for a stray. Most nights now, there's no bounce. Some nights I hear one, far under everything. Not loud enough to be a noise and not soft enough to be a thought. When I lock the gate with the Yale key, the chain slides and rings the way it always has. The sodium lamps hum. The lilies lean and learn the light. And every so often, as the rope settles, the bell answers itself with a tiny, precise tap. The sound you'd get if a ball kissed a gym floor in a place where a gym no longer is. The nameplates rattled in the windless dark, a thin metal chatter that sounded like coins rolling across the dead. I was halfway down row F with the gate keys in my fist when the ground under plot 67 sighed and eased a thumb width. The bell rope on the old watch house twitched once against the frame. I lifted my head, waiting for breeze that never came, and caught that smell again, wet iron and vinegar, as if a broken hydrant had bled into the dirt. I am 34 and work nights at St. Bridget's Churchyard on the Dallas line, a sliver of ground the subdivision forgot to swallow. The new streets on the far side of the fence are named for trees that never grew here, and the porches face the stone wall like it's a view. The developer halted Phase 3 when the excavator bucket found a rusted coffin beneath a cul-de-sac's rebar grid. The city froze permits. The church hired me to keep the fence from becoming a suggestion. That's why I was out there at 1 in the morning with a mag light and a brass ring of keys that never felt warm. Pastor Lee said to walk the perimeter every 2 hours, lock the chapel, check the mausoleum gate, and keep a log. I added my own rules. Count the row markers allowed. Note the puddles. Stand still for a full minute where the ground seems restless. 3 nights in, I started adding another line to the log. Sour metal smell at section D between the U's. The first time I wrote it, I thought it was runoff from a neighbor's sprinkler. The second time, I knew better because the grass there is salt tolerant and nothing else. The subdivision's security lights turn night into a low dome of cream. Inside that dome, our lamps are sodium orange and tired. The chapel is a brick box with a Yale rim lock, single key. The tool shed across from it holds a steel blower that I use once a week to clear seed pods off the path, though this time of year it's mostly plastic wrap from bouquets and the odd mylar balloon. The mausoleum sits at the far end by the wall the developer put up during Phase 1. It has a metal security gate to deter drunks and foxes. It rattles on dry nights like a kettle about to sing. Rosa was the only other person who walked in the dark with me. She was older than me by a handful of winters, and had a habit of tucking a pencil behind her ear and forgetting it was there. She comes on at 5 in the morning to prep for sunrise burials, water the grass, straighten flags, check the columbarium vases. She hums as she works, low, tuneless, steady, the kind of humming that holds a space together. I liked hearing it echo under the mausoleum's arch while the LEDs stuttered awake. The first week, the ground moved in little ways. A stone felt half a degree off when I put my palm on it. A drain cover under the chapel downspout growled longer than it should. The bell rope lifted the length of a knuckle when no one touched it. Little things. I put them in the log as if naming them could hold them still. Then on Friday, as I slid the chain through the main gate latch, a man called my name from the other side of the wall. He said it soft enough that I almost filed it under neighborhood noise. Then he said it again, just my name, and it had that same vinegar and pennies tang as section D. I put the chain down without finishing the lock, stepped to the wall, and shone my light over. New concrete, clean lines, raw dirt, a coil of orange conduit. No one there. I tasted metal like an old battery against my tongue. Pastor Lee listened with that steady face he uses for both gossip and grief. "You put the lock on before you went to look?" he asked. "Almost. Do it all the way next time." Fair. But he wrote something in his pocket notebook, and when I asked if it was related to the subdivision, he gave me a half smile. "It is related to keeping our bones in order," he said. "Take the chapel key with you on rounds. Don't leave it hanging." I never left the chapel key hanging after that. I threaded it onto the main ring and told myself it was about convenience. When I lay down in the caretaker room by the office window, I moved the key ring from the chair to the pillow by my cheek. The brass was cold when I woke. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Patel was already waiting by the little gate with lilies wrapped too tight in green paper. "I'm only a minute," she said, and I told her I could let her in now. She looked tired the way deep grief looks at month 11, as if the muscle that lifts the eyes never quite recovered. She liked to stand by the stone without touching it and talk as if her husband had just ducked inside for a coat. When she left, she pressed a coin into my palm and said, "For your pocket. You look pale." It was a nickel, warm from her hand, and it made the brass ring in my pocket feel colder by comparison. The cemetery has a handful of old coins left with stones in the old sections. Most are pennies turned dark by weather. I keep a ledger of them on paper in the office because I don't like leaving it to memory. People move coins around as a joke. I don't think they mean harm, but you feel it in your bones all the same. That afternoon, the developer's liaison came through the gate with a city inspector. The liaison wore a vest with reflective stripes and smiled like a billboard. The inspector was a man named Gomez with boots that left sharp square prints even on dry soil. They signed in, slipped plastic covers over their shoes, and walked with Pastor Lee to the back wall. I kept raking along the edge of the path and counted under my breath. When they returned, Gomez asked for our burial maps to copy. Pastor Lee said they stay on site. The liaison did most of the talking after that. More smiling, more promises of protective measures, more explanations about groundwater. He held his hands just below his heart when he spoke, palms up. I noticed he didn't step on the grass. That night we had heat lightning far off, the kind that flashes without sound and makes you think of a switch flipping somewhere. I followed my rounds. Perimeter, chapel, mausoleum, columbarium, watch house. At Section D, the smell was strong enough to taste. I held my breath for 3 steps and then took a full lung because you cannot do this job if you reject the air where you stand. My light slipped over stone after stone, catching the raised letters. 2 of the dates matched down to the day and month, different years, same number. I did the math and told myself coincidence has deep pockets. The curiosity that had been nibbling at me grew teeth. When was the wall poured? What records did the subdivision check? How many names were missing from our books? I carried the questions across the grass like they weighed nothing, and then almost dropped them when I saw the chapel door. It was standing open the width of my hand. I had locked it. I remembered because the Yale lock sometimes bites before the bolt seats and forces you to jiggle the key. I would not have forgotten the bite. Now the door was open, and the room beyond was a block of darker dark. I turned my light sideways to cut glare and swept the threshold. The dust line on the floor had a clean crescent where the door had moved. I put my finger into that crescent because I needed to feel it. "Rosa," I said, because speaking any name is better than leaving a space empty. No answer came. I stepped inside and breathed that strange air again. It lived here now too. Wet iron, a sour edge like old brass polished in vinegar. The chapel walls held all sound. The altar cloth lay smooth. The hymnals lined up. The closet where we keep the vases had the smell of floral preservative and oak. The only thing wrong was that open door. I closed it, locked it twice, and touched the bolt. It was cold enough to sting the tip of my finger. I made the next sweep faster than I liked and then slowed because faster meant missing. At the mausoleum, a motion sensor LED flickered on. Marble throws light back in a way that makes a person feel like a ghost themselves. I tested the gate. It held. The crypts inside have bronze nameplates that chip your nails if you trace them wrong. I didn't go in. I didn't want my breath to show. When I turned to leave, the LED stuttered again and held steady at a level that felt 1 notch too dim. At 4, Rosa came in with coffee and a thermos that had seen better days. She held it with both hands while we watched dawn dilute the orange lamps. "You heard them yet?" she asked without looking at me. "Them?" "Names," she said. "Not voices. Names. Like the wall is remembering." She set the thermos on the bench and moved her pencil from behind one ear to the other. I stopped answering. That seemed polite. Why polite? If you answer, they will assume you can deliver what they ask for. She took a sip and made a face. "I need a new thermos." The false safety landed then. If Rosa had heard it before and still came in humming, then the worst of it belonged to weather and paperwork. I took her pencil from her ear and set it on the bench. She smiled, small and real. We made our list for the day. Straighten flags in Section B. Scrape lichen from 3 stones in E. Coil the hose back in the west corner because someone always steals the nozzle. It felt good to put hands to tasks as the light came up. By noon, the liaison had sent an email they printed for us, so I read paper most of the morning. It was full of phrases like comprehensive mitigation and shallow subgrade variants. The letterhead shone like pride. None of it admitted to the casket the crew had dug around and poured over. That fact lived in every worker who touched that bucket. It lived in the new cracks that had formed in our lot line. I called the records clerk at the county because yes is easier to give a person on a phone than over email. Her name was Devondra, and her glasses were taped at the hinge when she stopped by later with a smile that said she chooses the field over the desk whenever she can. She brought photocopies of permits from 1887 to 1894, and a loose page from a ledger that recorded cholera deaths at the tail end of a summer none of us remembered. Some entries had names, others read only boy, Fisher Road, or infant. White House. We laid the copies next to our plot map, and I held my breath when a row on the ledger matched an empty strip of grass along the wall. "Do you see it?" I asked. "I see that you need another line of fence, and I see that someone tossed a basket of laundry in the river a long time ago. The river kept the water and tossed the socks back any which way." She tapped the ledger where the entries clotted. "This many in a week does not make for clean records." Pastor Lee stood in the doorway like a priest in a painting, hands folded, light from the window bending around his shoulders. "We will hold what we can," he said. "The rest we will name in general. Our ground is a promise." He looked at me as if to make sure I heard the promise too. I did. I kept my eyes on the paper so I wouldn't have to show him what else I had heard in the night. That evening the heat broke hard, the kind of drop that makes crickets change their pitch. I put on a beanie because damp air eats heat off your scalp. The ring of keys felt heavier. Not with weight, but with the idea of lifting one at the wrong time. I traced the bitting on the chapel key with my thumb until it felt familiar again. Then I went out and started the count. Gate. Chain through, latch seated, padlock clicked. Perimeter. Fence line checked, ties tight. Chapel door bolt hinge. Section marker post straight. Mausoleum gate. That's where the night peeled. The gate was hanging open 3 inches. No lock sat in the hasp, though I remembered setting it. I shone my light on the ground and found the lock where it lay in a tuft of sedge. It had grit in the shackle as if someone had rolled it in the path before dropping it. I picked it up with my sleeve and wiped the grit away. Something in the air changed as I closed the gate and fed the shackle home. The vinegar edge went sweet for one breath and then came back stronger. I know the difference between fear that belongs to me and fear that belongs to the air. This belonged to the air. I took 1 step inside, 2, and listened. Marble breathes differently than stone outside. The reflect does something to sound. Makes it come around a beat later than expected. I caught a second echo. Beneath that deeper, a low steady hum like a fridge compressor 5 rooms away. It had no business living in a mausoleum built in the 1920s. I followed the hum with my light off because I didn't want to chase shadows. The LEDs kept up a dim stutter every 20 seconds. On the left wall, near niche row C, the hum felt strongest. I put my palm flat to the marble. Cold. The hum went through the bone of my hand. I left my palm there and counted to 8. On 7, something under the stone gave a soft knock, 1 beat only, and then silence. I didn't jerk my hand back because sometimes your dignity is the only equipment you have left. When I came back out, I wrote 2 things in the log. Hum under row C, lockdown. I added for myself, smell present. Then I crossed that last part out because naming it from here felt like giving it a chair. Just after 2, I heard the bell rope in the watch house move. 3 slow tugs, each separated by the time it takes to hear your own breath. The rope lifted and fell without ringing the bell, because the clapper has a piece of felt tied around it to keep neighbors from complaining. The rope burns my palm if I hold it wrong. When I opened the watch house door and touched the rope, the felt was damp. I went back to the office and sat on the floor with the plot map spread out and the brass keys next to my knee. The ledger page from Devendra balanced on a clipboard. I traced the old entries where the handwriting faltered, where someone got tired or scared or both. The river and the socks, that's how she had said it, but a person can still match sock to sock. I laid a sheet of tracing paper over the map and made small marks where the empty strip of grass ran under the wall. That's when I noticed a misnumbering in our own records, a gap of 4 plots bridged by a line someone had penned in the 1950s. The line ended in a circle around a single surname, Dwayne, without dates. We have 1 Dwayne Stone. It leans, raised letters darkened by lichen. When I walked out to it with the tracing paper folded in my pocket, my breath made a small cloud. That made no sense because the air had warmed. My headlamp caught condensation on the nameplate screw, a bead ready to fall that never did. The soil at the base held a shadow as if it were wet by floodlight alone. I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the dirt. It was cold enough to make my fingertips ache. Under the seep of cold, I felt a roundness like the lip of a pipe. I went back for the grave probe. It's a metal rod with a rounded tip that you push into the ground to locate vaults and edges. I sank it beside the stone, easy, and heard that same hollow knock I'd felt under the mausoleum. I took a second point, 2 feet south. Another knock. Between them, the sound went away as if a door were open. That was my first real decision point of the night. Ignore it and write a note to explore in daylight, or chase it while the air still held that sour edge. I am not proud of the choice I made. I went to the tool shed, took the manual jack and the stone lever and brought them to Dwayne. I set the lever on the lip and eased weight. The stone lifted a ½ inch without protest, like something had been waiting for me to do exactly that. I only needed it to lean enough to see under. What I saw was not a coffin lid or vault brick. It was concrete poured where the ground had sunk, smooth but with a thin dark seam running under the base of the stone toward the wall. I reached into that seam with 2 fingers and felt water, not much, cold, standing, metallic on my skin. When I brought my fingers to my nose, I almost gagged. Vinegar and iron. The subdivision's waterline runs parallel to the wall. I had walked it with Gomez that afternoon. I imagined a hairline leak feeding into old ground that knew how to carry liquid where it wanted. Put the stone back the way it had been and called. "Pastor Lee?" He answered on the second ring with a voice like someone who keeps the phone near the bed. "I am coming," he said before I finished. Do not open anything further. I haven't, I said, which was true in the narrowest sense. But the mausoleum hums. It would, he said, as if hum were a season in the church calendar. He arrived 10 minutes later with a flashlight that made mine look like a toy. He wore a jacket over pajamas and better boots than I own. When I showed him the seam, he closed his eyes for a breath. I can get Gomez to shut the line in the morning, he said. We cannot break concrete tonight and claim we were only curious. We will secure. Then we will ask the city to touch what is theirs we secured. He stood with me at the mausoleum while I checked the lock again. We walked row C and C again, listening. The hum had gathered itself into a steadier tone, like the throat of a man trying not to cough. Pastor Lee put his palm on the marble and then took it away quickly, as if he didn't want whatever it carried to ride his skin back to the office. They built that wall like a lid, he said. Lids keep things in both directions. We went to the watch house last. He brushed the rope with 2 fingers and it did not move. Then he wrote a single line in my log in his square letters. If anyone calls your name, do not answer from near the wall. The false safety broke before dawn when the ground by the columbarium gave a soft chuck. A neat circle of soil sank half an inch and let out a bubble of air that smelled like the inside of a brass trumpet. I watched the soil settle like someone in a slow elevator. The penny taste hit my tongue hard enough to make me spit into the grass. That was when I decided the climax would not wait for daylight, city permits, or stronger coffee. This is the part where I tell you what I did, and you can decide if it counts as foolishness or faith. The seam by Dwayne's stone led toward the wall and down. The hum under row C suggested a cavity that wasn't there last spring. The bell rope tugged 3 times when the gate chain lay unlatched. I could wait for sunrise and a shut-off valve, or I could pull one door and put eyes on the void. I chose the door. The oldest vault in our mausoleum has a maintenance grate in the floor, cast iron, 4 bolts. We keep a wrench in the tool shed for it, tagged on a nail with an old piece of ribbon. I took the wrench and a roll of caution tape. I set the tape in an X around the grate not because anyone would come, but because a person needs rituals. Then I knelt and put the wrench to the bolts in a pattern that would not seize the plate. One loosened easy, one fought. My breath became a metronome. The LED above me stuttered and then steadied. I lifted the grate and caught the smell full in the face. Vinegar, iron, a note like old pennies in the mouth of a river. I set the grate aside. Beneath it lay a space not much higher than my shoulder width. Concrete rim, old brick, black water, and the suggestion of corrugated pipe as if someone had abandoned a plan. The hum lived down there. It thrummed against the bones of my ear. I wanted to lower my light and see the lay of it. I wanted not to put my hand into anything that could climb up my arm. The decision belonged to me, and I chose to lie on my stomach and slide the light in first. I felt the LED heat against my cheek where it grazed the floor. The beam landed on brick never meant to be seen. The underside of stone, a thin sheet of water running toward the wall. Something gleamed where the water fell, a brass coupling. New metal married to old brick without much care. The thread had wept a line that turned green where it dried. That was all I needed. Proof enough to demand a shutoff. Proof that the subdivision's line had found the path of least resistance through a place that already remembered water, and waste, and bodies. I snapped a photo for the file and then heard it. Not my name. Not voices. A roll call. Soft, careful, steady. Names I had read on the ledger in Devandra's stack, spoken once as if called from a doorway. The sound came through the water as much as the air. Each name made the hum lean a fraction toward a pitch of speech. I had the sudden sense that if I let one hand slip, I would slide in, and if I slid in, I would not find the bottom. I pulled myself back and sat up, spine against marble. My hands shook enough that I had to rest the grate on the floor before I could set it back. The bolts went in easier than they had come out. I stood and breathed through my mouth until the taste faded. Then the LED overhead flickered twice and went so still I could hear the traffic wash from the highway fold into the wind. Breath. I taped the X more carefully. I wrote a note for Rosa and taped it to the gate. Do not enter. Grate open earlier. Hum persistent, leak suspected. I called Gomez and left a message in his office system because 2 a.m. is not for courtesy. Then I called Pastor Lee, who answered at once. I am awake, he said. I felt it. You felt it. In the way a person feels a change in a house, he said. And he was already on his way. He arrived with a jacket zipped up to his throat and a flashlight beam that doesn't drift in the rain. I showed him the photo. He looked more tired than worried. "We can fix a leak," he said, and I realized I had been waiting to hear that sentence since the first night. He left to meet the city crew at the gate, and I stayed by the mausoleum because leaving felt like turning my back on a man you do not trust. They shut the line just after 5 with a wrench that belonged to the city. When the water eased, the hum changed its shape, softened, then sank to a register that felt tired. The soil near Dwayne lifted a hair as if it had taken a long breath out, and found there was room to inhale again. I crouched, hand flat to the ground, and felt the long lagging echo of that motion. Rosa arrived then, humming, and stopped hum and step at once when she saw where I was looking. "No use telling me to go inside," she said. "I brought gloves." We spent sunrise taping off the seam lines and writing a note for Mrs. Patel explaining that Lily should go to the chapel today, and she would understand why when she saw the tape. The day was warm without being cruel. I told my body that we had turned a corner. At 9, when the city had finished capping the coupling and the developer's liaison stood on the path making gestures about excavation protocols, the ground by the wall made a sound like a low cough. A neat oval of dirt at the fence line let go. Not sinkhole big, not dramatic, enough to show brick where soil had been. Old brick that should not have been visible at grade. Gomez stared, then crouched and brushed dirt aside with one finger the way you touch a wound you suspect is older than a day. "I want to know who made this wall," he said in a voice that wasn't for the liaison, "and I want their plan. Today." The liaison placed his hands below his heart and smiled less. "We have a plan," he said. "We've always had a plan." Rosa laughed once without humor. "Everyone has a plan until the ground breathes," she said. The rest of the day ran out in tasks and waiting. The city posted a notice. The developer packed up his smile and sent an email I never read. Pastor Lee led a short prayer in the chapel for the unknown, whose names we would use in general and specifically where we could. He asked me to ring the bell. I pulled the rope and it answered through its felt muffler with a dull, honest thud. When I tied it back, my palm stung, the same mild burn as before, but this time it felt earned. Night again. The dome of light over the subdivision had sharpened to a glare at the farthest edge of our fence, because crews had set work lamps. The keys in my pocket felt heavier. I started the rounds with a stubborn faith that the worst had been named and would therefore behave. The chapel door was closed and locked. I tested it 3 times, gentle, then once with an unnecessary shove. Inside, the air smelled like old polish and dryer sheets from the closet where we keep the funeral linens. No vinegar edge. I checked the window latch and found it seated. My log held a tidy line of check marks. The mausoleum gate was still taped X and the grate lay where I had set it, bolt snug. The hum was gone from Rosie. In its place, a silence with weight. I should have taken that as safety. Instead, I recognized it as one of the shapes fear wears when it tires of standing in the doorway. I walked Section D and counted steps. When I reached Dwayne, the condensation bead on the nameplate screw had finally let go and fallen, leaving a clean path through the dust on the metal like a tear. The soil at the base looked level. I crouched anyway and laid my hand flat until the cold lifted out of my skin. I stood with my palm against the stone long enough to feel silly. Then behind me, down near the wall, a voice said the first of the ledger names in a voice I knew. It was my own, stretched a touch thin as if I were talking through a note rolled into a bottle. The sound did not come from the wall or the ground or the air in between. It came from the brass ring of keys against my thigh. I didn't move for a full slow count to 8. When I took the keys out of my pocket, they were colder than the night justified. They smelled like Section D on a bad hour. The chapel key, the one Pastor Lee had told me to always keep on me, had a smudge of green on the bitting like a fingerprint of oxidation. I held the ring away from my body and listened. The roll call whispered again, softer. That tired hum folded into names. I set the ring on the stone and took my hand away. The whisper stopped. I don't have the right words for what it felt like then, except to say the cemetery felt like a house where a child had been crying far away and had finally fallen asleep. It wasn't peace. It was the part that comes before peace, where every footfall is considered. Rosa came up the aisle with her pencil reclaimed behind her ear and a new thermos. She looked at the keys on the stone and then at me. "We do not put metal there," she said. "I think we do today," I said. "Just for an hour." She nodded and we both stood looking at our own reflections in that small piece of brass, indistinct, tall and short. blurred by the dust we never fully shift. She unscrewed the thermos and handed it to me. It tasted like church coffee always tastes when made by someone who cares more for warmth than flavor. The shift change came. The day ride-by started. The city's truck idled by the gate for a check-in with Pastor Lee. I left the keys on Dwayne until the sun took a strong bite and then picked them up. They were only keys again. They warmed in my hand as if that had always been their nature. We did not bury anyone that day. We did not pour concrete or move stones. We wrote names from Devandra's ledger on a sheet that had more blank lines than ink. We taped the wall line and told the liaison he would not use our path. The developer's men put away their long smiles and used tape measures instead. The bell rope hung still. Section D smelled like grass and dust. That was a week ago. The shutoff held. The hum has not returned. The nameplates rattle sometimes, but only when they should. I still carry the keys. I still wake with the ring under my cheek. I still taste metal when the wind slides along the wall, but it fades when I step into the chapel and touch the bolt. Sometimes on the last round before dawn, I walk to the mausoleum and sit on the steps with the watch house behind me, and the subdivision's lamps doing their best to turn night into a project. I look at row C and row D and the corner where the ledger goes soft with numbers no one remembered to connect. I count the rows out loud until the count steadies me. When I stand, I put a hand to the brass key and swallow. On Tuesday, a city worker in a clean shirt asked if we had smelled anything odd since the fix. I said the air had improved. He said good, nodded, and then asked my name to write on a form. When he wrote it, the pen caught for a second and left a dot of ink that looked like a bead of water drying on a screw. I signed beneath it without thinking, and the paper carried the smell of the form cabinet in his truck. That night, I did the last circuit with Rose's humming carried by air that finally tasted like rain might arrive. I locked the chapel, checked the mausoleum, and stood by Dwayne until the beanie itched. When I turned to go, the bell rope whispered against the wood without moving. I looked back at the keys hanging from my finger and realized there was a faint green smear on the chapel key again, as if it had kissed copper in my pocket. The air held a clean edge that could go either way. I pocketed the ring and walked the path toward the gate. The nameplates didn't rattle. The ground didn't sigh. The watch house kept its secrets. At the gate, I set the chain and seated the lock. When the shackle clicked, a breath moved under the soil by the fence and lifted one thin blade of grass. The movement was nothing. It was everything that will be here long after the subdivision forgets what its streets are named for. I leaned my forehead for a second against the warm metal of the gate. On my way back past Section D, I paused where the smell always sat, but tonight it wasn't there. In its place was the faintest scent of old polish and the hint of lilies that had been wrapped too tight. My pocket felt heavier by a gram. I took the keys out and held them up until the sodium lamp lit them. The chapel key's bitting caught the light in a way that made a single narrow line across my palm like a seam. I rubbed my thumb along that line, then put the keys back in my pocket and said the names I could remember without looking at the ledger. I said them softly, one after the other, until the fence line felt like it belonged to the living again. The wind did not lift. The bell did not ring. The night held. As I turned toward the office, a cool breath rose from the soil by Dwayne and pressed close enough that I caught the old edge for one heartbeat, vinegar and penny. It did not carry a word. It didn't need to. The brass key in my pocket warmed, as if any metal left in our ground had chosen which way to lean. That was enough. I walked, and the watch house rope stayed still, and the last light at the far end of row C blinked once and then held steady while the names I knew waited, quiet, under their stones. The first sound was the soil settling. It came from Section D like a low exhale, a soft slump against the wooden borders we used to keep the trench edges clean. Then the gate chain at the perimeter gave one dry slide through the hasp and stilled again. In the sodium light, the row markers looked like short bones standing to attention. I remember smelling hot pennies even though the night was cold. I'm 33, night security for the city's parks and a contracted pair of eyes for a historic potter's field in the Bronx. The old church sold the land a century ago. The markers are numbers, not names. Last week, the subway expansion clipped an unrecorded corner underground, then backed out and capped the drift. Since then, we've been told to keep watch until the engineers finish their survey. That's why I was there at 2 a.m., with a mag light, a Motorola on my belt, and a leather key wallet for the Yale locks that never line up right after rain. The office sits low by the maintenance gate. It still smells like furniture polish from the clerk who uses it by day. I warmed my hands on the baseboard heater and radioed a quick sweep. Watch to house, starting section C clockwise. Mara answered from her loop on the north fence, a click before her voice. She always clicks first, like punctuation. Copy, slow your step on the slope. Clay slick. The clay smell reached me as I crossed the gravel. It wasn't the usual damp loam. It was sharp, with that metallic bite you get when you handle keys for too long. The soil in D is redder than the rest. It holds footprints in a clean way, crisp edges like the ground is paying attention. My own prints filled with water as I went. There was no rain, just a fine cold suspended in the light. Someone had moved marker 34 by an inch. You'd miss it if you didn't sweep often. The weed whip line we cut last week still showed, and the stake was outside it. I crouched, felt for the hole, and found a thread of water tracking against the grain of the earth. I set the stake true and checked the trench boards. They hadn't bowed, but they hummed when I put my knuckles to them. It was so faint I might have called it nerves. Then my radio hissed and snapped to life. Gate? Mara said, and did you touch the gate? Chain slid once, I said. Wind could do it. There's no wind, she said. Click, copy. I tried to make the humming mundane. We've got a service conduit that crosses under the dirt road there. Old clay pipe for water that was cut and abandoned long before I started. Sometimes you hear air in pipes even when they're dead. You tell yourself that. The city sealed the tunnel last night, welding a plate over the shaft they'd cut to backfill. It sits just outside the fence line, but if you stand in section D, you can feel it in your knees when trucks hit potholes on the perimeter road. I kept moving. In C, a plastic vase tapped itself against a low stone border. The beetles love those vases. You can hear them inside like fingers drumming. The vase stopped when I reached it, as if it knew it had been seen. A few plots over, someone had left coins in the old style. A line of dimes on a granite slab. We discouraged that, not because of ghosts, but because the copper stains the stone. These hadn't stained, which meant they were new. I pocketed them to drop at the office. The church's former receiving vault squats halfway up the rise, a rectangle of limestone with a door the color of old spoons. We keep it dry and mostly empty now, a staging place for restoration projects. The brass hasp wears through padlock shackles faster than it should. I checked the seal with the tip of my key. No play, no frost. A tiny smear of clay on the lower hinge plate that I wiped with my glove. No footprints except mine, except the number 34 stake on the rise had a twin. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, the way you see your own car in a lot where it shouldn't be. Another 34, slotted between 46 and 47, which makes no sense in any direction. I took the hand-drawn plot map from my pocket and traced the grid. The day clerk, Mr. Rahman, draws clean little squares, each with a number and a dot for row markers. He marks trench runs with dashed lines. There was one square scratched and rubbed thin in section D as if he erased and the paper finally gave. That's where 34 sits. There wasn't any 34 up here. I pulled the stake. On the underside, the ink bled through the wood in a darker way, as if the numbers were written heavier than usual. The smell of keys again, strong enough to taste. I set the stake aside and radioed. House, are you near the office? I asked. By the north fence, Mara said. Click. Why? Double-check the key log when you get there. Make sure the drift lock key is still hung. You worry it grew legs, she said, trying to make it light. Another click. She uses 2 when she's not sure. I kept walking to the top of the rise to look down over section C and D like I always do. The sodium lamps left patches of orange like minor fires in a wet street. The city wasn't visible, not here, just a wash of distant traffic. I breathed and watched my breath in the headlamp beam. The humming was under me again, faint, alternating like a tamped-down generator behind walls. A human thing makes itself known in the smallest wrong. The way the lock tongue sits a hair proud of the hasp. The way a door doesn't close on the first push. When I went back to the receiving vault door, the Yale tongue was exactly flush, but the paint around the escutcheon plate was a fraction cleaner, like a coin rubbed once. I put my ear to the seam. Nothing. Just the building breathing cool air into a colder night. That's when Gomez called my cell. He's a day laborer we use for heavy resets, takes pride in leaving square boot prints when he's done. He rarely calls at night. You there? He said. They told me to leave my hard hat in the office. Did you see it? On the shelf by the log, I said. You left smears on it, Clay? Not mine, he said. They told me to walk out fast. I washed after. Listen, don't go under. Wait for daylight. I'm not going under, I said, because it was true in that moment. And it's sealed. There's a style of reassurance you learn on nights like this. Say the reasonable thing. Let your voice be sturdy. Let the details be small and boring. You do that for others and for yourself. I hung up and finished my loop. When I came down past the office, I stopped in to check the shelf. 3 hard hats sat there, city orange. Gomez's had a faint handprint across the crown, the kind that leaves the heel of the palm clean and the fingers laden. It looked dry, but when I touched it with my knuckle, the tack read as recent. I washed in the utility sink, the water going pink-brown where clay met metal in the old pipes. The smell rose like steam from a train axle. Keylog reads true, Mara said at the door. She had her beanie pulled down to her eyebrows. Drift key in place. Vault key in place. Office key in your hand. You going back up? We'll sweep one more time, I said. Then I'll sit a spell. She clicked once and we both listened to our radios being perfectly quiet. In quiet like that, you hear your pulse in your ears and count it just to prove you can. We split at the road. I took the rise. She cut along the fence. I passed the dimes in my pocket from one hand to the other and heard them clink. That's when I smelled the earth metal again, the strongest yet, like someone had opened a tin of wet pennies beneath my nose. I looked for standing water to blame it on and found none. The boards in D shivered as if something inside the trench exhaled. I put the flashlight beam narrow and followed it along the seam where the trench meets the lane. A darker line cut across the gravel, a hairline as if a sheet had settled under it. I wanted daylight. I told myself so out loud, wait for daylight. The first "it's fine" of the night. I sat on the low wall by C and let my legs feel heavy until the thought passed. The humming returned, quieter, then gone, then quiet again in the way of something pacing. When it didn't come back, I stood, a little lighter, and decided to prove how normal this was by doing paperwork. The receiving vault key weighs more than it looks. The bitting is worn smooth from a century of hands that turned it to ordinary ends. I took the ledger and the key and told Mara on the radio. Going to inspect the vault. Log says monthly. It's due. Daylight thing, she said. Click, click. Do it with me. Just a look. I'll leave it locked. You always say that, she said. But she let it go with a single click that meant I'd read the lecture later. The vault door sighed at the seal when I moved the tongue. A damp exhale met my face. Inside, the fluorescents buzz when they start, always 2 beats before they glow. The light coughed itself awake and the shadows became straight lines. Someone had tucked the gurney cover under itself too neatly. The old slate shelves along the walls were clean, which only looked wrong because everything else was dusted with fine clay. There were boot prints on the floor I could map to Tuesday's crew by tread, Gomez's squares among them. And along the back wall over the joint where limestone meets poured concrete, a line of smudges at shoulder height. I touched one with the back of my glove. Grit, not paint, it flaked. The pattern was vaguely human if you wanted it to be, but I've watched cinnamon rats run that seam and leave their bodies as grease. I told myself it was that. I almost believed it. I moved to the back and dropped to a knee. The seam ran true for 2 yards and then faded where the concrete was newer. The light in here always tunnels. A narrow cone the color of cheap milk. I swept it along the floor and found the square trap we almost never open. It's more of a gratitude gesture now when families ask about the old tours. There used to be stairs down to a drainage channel. They were bricked in 1978 after a kid fell and broke himself. The brick is thicker than necessary and proud at the edges from poor tuck pointing. I put my ear to the brick and heard nothing. That's when the humming came through the walls, not from below but from behind. The way sound carries in winter through a heavy coat. I should have called it. I should have logged the noise, shut the door, and waited for Mr. Rahman or the city engineer at 8. Instead, I took the brass key out of my pocket again and tapped it against the brick once and waited, like an idiot asking for a response. It answered, but not in a way you can diagram. The answer felt like a pressure moving past me, like someone shouldered by without touching. The fluorescence quivered. The maglite beam juddered across the seam. On the shelf behind me, something rattled in a slow, uninterested way, as if an old label had come loose and was talking in the air. I stood without meaning to, my knees spilling grit. From the far wall came the smell of keys and coins and wet clay. and in it was a trace that wasn't smell at all, like a battery against the tongue. The radio made its small pre-speech hiss, then nothing. That happens. You think to talk and you don't. I held the little button down and found my voice. House to watch, I said, my own call sign backward because it was easier to grab. I'm inside the vault. I've got a smell, possible gas, copy, Mara said at once. The double click that would usually come after didn't. I'm at the fence. I hear something in D, stay where you are. Get distance from the trench, I said. If it's gas. It isn't gas, she said, and then almost like she'd already moved before telling me, I'm going to the office for the meter. The air steadied. The fluorescents made their usual electrical bees. The smell hung without a source like the ghost of someone who had just used the sink and left water on the porcelain. I wrote 3 words in the ledger because action is a bridge. Odor in vault. The letters leaned more than usual, which looked enough like someone else's handwriting to unsettle me. I drew a small underline. When I turned the page back to log the hour, the corner snagged, and there was that rubbed thin square again in section D. The paper translucent where someone had erased it until its fibers opened and showed the ghost of the grid beneath. A footstep on the gravel outside cleared the show from my head. I locked the vault door with the kind of care you use when you want to hear the mechanics work. Tongue slides, hasp meets, tension sets. When the padlock took, I tugged twice and felt that honest resistance only steel can give. The night had brightened 1 degree. That effect happens when your eyes decide to cooperate and pull more detail from the same light. Mara came up the road at a jog, the Draeger clipped to her jacket. Zero gas, she said, breathing through her scarf. But you smell it. You don't? I asked. Clay, she said, and then she stopped because we both heard it. Not the humming. The trench boards in D side, a real release of something that had been held. It wasn't loud. It was the sound you get when a boot comes out of a stuck spot. We both moved faster than we meant to. The desk lamp in the office flared in the corner of my eye, which didn't make sense because I hadn't left it on. It must have been the way the sodium light hit the window. If I keep this to the parts that can be checked, I can say that the trench boards in section D had shifted 1/2 inch toward the lane. You could see the seam like a paragraph indent running along the gravel. The 34 stake I'd reset drew a little crescent where it leaned against its own hole, and where the seam made a small V near the edge, there was a smear the color of old tea where something damp had touched and then let go. Mara went still. I'm calling this in, she said, because saying that puts a structure around a thing. We need barriers and we need the engineer. Do it, I said. Fall safety, 2nd round. I stood watch like my job title promised and let the procedure warm me. She got PD dispatch. The night sergeant we both know who believes in paperwork and poor lighting. He said a car was coming and a supervisor would call us. We let that stroke our fear into a manageable shape. It didn't last. The chain at the maintenance gate slid again. Not from wind. The latch walked itself a 1/4 inch. I heard it because the quiet was tuned to metal sounds. I went toward it and kept my headlamp low so the beam wouldn't jump when my heart did. The gate stood as we'd left it. The padlock was in. The hasp was set. But the angle had changed as if the fence had taken a breath. Beyond it, past the perimeter. The black shape of the welded plate at the drift caught no light but refused to be void. There is a way steel exists at night that steals the warmth of everything nearby. I felt that come off it even through the fence. Behind me, Mara crouched by the board seam. Give me the probe, she said. I didn't like that. The grave probe is a thin rod of steel with a T-handle, meant to read the firmness of fill when the ground reports false. You push, you feel for the change in resistance that tells you where wood is and where air begins. It is a tool for daylight and calm. I handed it over without arguing. She slid the tip along the seam and pressed. It went in 2 inches and met refusal like muscle. She tried again 6 inches over, another 2 inches, another stop. She set her face to ignore the night and keep pressure where pressure is honest. Then she pressed at the V and the probe sank until her knuckles hit the gravel. We both froze and listened for a cavity's sound. It didn't echo. It didn't take in air. It took the rod and held it. Not stuck, not grabbing, but complete, like sliding into a sleeve that fits too perfectly to remove. She tugged once and it stayed. She tugged twice and it released with that same boot-out-of-mud sigh. When it came free, the metal smelled like pennies in vinegar. Something scuffed inside the receiving vault behind us. Not in it, behind it. The radio hissed. The night sergeant's voice came far away. Unit diverted to priority. Sit tight. Supervisor 10 out. You copy? I said. Because saying sit tight to someone on the phone and hearing it bounce back through a radio is one of those small indignities that wake the feral in you. We need a barrier. The phone clicked to dead air in that way that means he's talking to someone else and can't manage us at once. Procedure said we should cone the lane, tape the trench, and back away. We started to do exactly that. I took the cones from the office, set them like a harmless game of triangles, and felt better for the human geometry they made. Mara walked the tape across. Her glove left a small smear of clay on the orange plastic without touching anything wet. The smell turned stronger, then thinned. I think that's when I decided the vault was the safer place to stand. A stone room with one door, a lock I trust, and walls that don't move. Decision under pressure. You go where your head can straighten even if your feet know better. Inside, I said. Just to check it again? Just to check, she said, repeating my lie to make it shared. We opened the door and the fluorescence didn't hesitate this time. Light came honest. Shelves clean, floor scuffed with Tuesday's boots, and on the back seam, new smears at a lower height as if someone had leaned with wet hands and turned to listen. I had the sense, the precise shape of it, that if I touched the wall with my own hands, my gloves would pick up the smell and carry it. And then everything I handled would translate the odor into the language of keys and coins. There are moments you wrong-foot the night and it forgives you by ignoring your misstep. I went to the ledger on the shelf and wrote again. Cone trench. Awaiting supervisor. My pen cut slightly into the page where the paper had thinned, and for a fraction of a second the tip sank as if the page had no back. You can call that nerves and cheap paper. I do. A drop hit the floor. We both flinched. It was only water falling from the lintel, tracking through lime dust, but the drop erased a small fingerprint smear at knee height on the wall, and that felt like a gesture too neat to be accidental. I closed the ledger and the brass key in my fist went warm the way metal does when it takes your heat. Dawn in 3 hours, Mara said softly. We hold pattern. We watch. We left the door open to see the lane and took turns listening. At some point, a truck hit the far pothole and the plate at the drift thrummed. The sound walked the fence, found the gate, and put its knuckles into the chain like a bored kid making a point. Twice, spaced a long breath apart. Then nothing. The tape on our cones moved, only that. We stayed until the sky moved from black to deep oil blue, the hour when the city's long breath changes. The supervisor came first, bright parka and coffee, face creased into morning shapes. Behind him waddled Mr. Rahman with his thermos and his careful calm. The sergeant arrived with 2 officers who stamped their feet and made the correct skeptical remarks about tape and cones and night noises. The engineer, late as always, touched the seam with his boot and said we'd done right to keep off it. They looked at the plate, past the fence, and all said in various bureaucratic ways that it would be handled. Nobody said our names. We signed the forms where they pointed. When they moved the cones to lay their own, I saw the numbers on our stakes again, the single 34 where it should be. No twin on the rise. The board seemed a clean line now like a healed cut. The smell had fallen to a trace like the bitter left after you chew a pencil. We walked Mr. Rahman to the office to hand back the keys. He writes in the ledger with a black pen that has a gold clip and a cracked cap. He saw my odor in vault, and I watched his face change in a way that wasn't about fear, but about accuracy. He made a small dot beside the words. I'll mark the inspection, he said. No one goes under today. He poured tea into the lid of his thermos and offered it without looking up. I took off Gomez's hard hat from the shelf and brought it to the light. The handprint across the crown had dried to a dusty map. Not a single smear, but 5 distinct ridges and a heel, like someone had pressed long enough to say they were present and uninterested. I showed it to the sergeant, who squinted, then shrugged and made a note he would phrase safely later. Mara clicked her radio once for herself. Her beanie had left a line across her forehead. She rubbed it and then stopped, smelling her glove. It's on me, she said, surprised at the intimacy of odor. That metal stink. From the probe. It fades, I said. Wash with hot water. It'll cut the clay. We walked the supervisor to the rise. He took the probe himself and pushed near the V. The rod went in and met refusal as it should. He nodded to no one, then signed a form to himself with his parka as a table. We'll board it tighter, he said, which is one of those phrases that mean less the more you use them. He left the boards in the air to us until the day crew. By the time the east lit the walls of the vault a pale yellow, the smell had become memory. I left Mr. Rahman with his pen in the ledger and went back up for one last look. I like to end my shift at the high point, where I can count off rows and leave the place with its geometry intact. The dimes ticked in my pocket when I climbed. At the top, the city finally showed as a dull band beyond the trees. The humidity pinned my breath low. Section D sat correctly, board straight, tape fluttering a tired inch. I stood a long moment because that's the kind of superstition you grow when you spend your nights in practical places. On my way down, I passed the receiving vault and put my fingers to the seam not because I had to, but because I like answers even when they don't talk back. The stone felt as it should, cold, a little damp where it takes the night. My glove left a clean spot. Behind it, the fluorescents hummed the way they always do. I started to pull away and then smelled it again. Not strong, just there, just enough to lay a line through the morning's new honesty. Back at the office, Mr. Rahman had left the ledger open for a final sign. He'd drawn a small square on the Section D page, not where the rubbed thin place sits, but adjacent. In his neat hand, "Hold until survey." He tapped the page with his gold-clip pen. "You did right," he said, which is a simple sentence that asks you to carry more than it says. He poured a second lid cup of tea and slid it across the desk. "You'll smell it in your gloves for a day," he added with the calm of someone who has stood in rooms that ask more than they answer. I signed my name. The date above mine repeated an odd way across the last week's pages, twice on Tuesday, twice on Thursday, both times corrected with a tiny line. I had not noticed that before. He closed the ledger and the paper breathed against the covers, letting off a faint trace of that same earth metal you think you imagined. When I went to hang the vault key, the leather wallet made a print on the shelf, dark for a second and then gone. I looked at my palm without meaning to. There was no clay there. The smell came anyway, thin as a hairline crack under gravel, honest as a chain sliding a single link through a hasp. The day crew clattered at the gate. Someone laughed at the wrong time. The radio crackled with calls that had nothing to do with us. I walked out to the rise to count the rows one more time before sleep, and we found 34 sitting where it should be, straight in the neat cut of last week's line. The earth held it like a throat holds a swallowed truth. I pressed my boot heel into the gravel by the seam until the imprint took. The ground gave me nothing back. That should have been the end of it. On my way down, a drop fell from the vault lintel and erased a little smear at knee height that hadn't been there a moment earlier. It made that small sound water makes on stone, a sound your bones recognize. I didn't look for a source. I didn't open the door. I let the smell of keys ride the morning air until it was just city again, and then I turned the office heater off, and I left the ledger closed on the desk. I'm writing this because the smell returned 2 nights later in my apartment when I set my keys down on the counter. The room warmed around them in a way that felt like exhale. When I lifted the keys, there was a faint, clean handprint under the ring, 5 ridges, a heel, already drying to nothing. It didn't smudge. It didn't stain. It simply made itself known and then quiet. And when I stepped closer to the wall to make sense of it, the baseboard sighed the way the boards in D do before settling. The sound was small and very sure. The night didn't change. The city kept its long breath, but I could smell the ground again, sharp as wet copper, as if the ledger had been opened in a room I wasn't standing in. The first time I heard the humming, I thought a transformer was failing. It wasn't the power line kind of buzz. It came from the stone itself, low and even, the way a bottle's mouth sings when you run a wet finger around it. I was sitting at the columbarium gate with the night ledger open, and the sound made the brass pen vibrate against the paper. Then it stopped like someone lifted a finger. The wind had been still the whole time. I'm 29, night security at Greenlawn Municipal in Houston. Garden Cemetery. Big enough to get lost once and pretend it was on purpose. My job starts at 10 and ends when the crows arrange themselves on the east fence. I count the steps between the sodium lamps, check locks, log every odd thing so the day crew doesn't think it was their imagination. Tonight started like any other July night here. Air heavy enough to press my shirt to my back. Motion sensors kicking on with that late half-second lag that makes you talk to them like they're stubborn dogs. I was assigned to the northwest quadrant and the columbarium bank called C, the newest of our concrete galleries. The city poured it last year after a relocation, which is why I think I hear the humming now. Officially, we call it the Reeves transfer, like it was a train arriving. Unofficially, everyone calls it the Walmart Bones, because before those niches existed, those names belonged to the prison cemetery under a demolished yard where they're putting up a superstore. The contractors did the paperwork. The city took the remains. I don't make policy. I count lamps. On nights like this, the metal smell settles along the rows. Not blood, nothing like that. Think pennies left in a jar of water on a radiator. I get it by niche C17 through C23 most often. Strongest by the little drainage grate in the slab walk. Luis, the city electrician, says concrete sweats like people if the day was hot enough and the night cools fast. He taps the walls with a knuckle and calls it structure singing. He jokes a lot even when his fingers shake around a screwdriver. Luis had been there at sunset to check the corridor LEDs. They stutter sometimes when the motion sensors lag. "If the strip starts that slow roll again, radio me," he said, pushing his glasses up with the back of his wrist. He always leaves his tool bucket just to the side of the key box like he's daring me to trip on it. And for the love of God, lock C by 11. That new Yale's fussy. The new lock does stick. It's a rim job on a steel door, and if you don't pull the handle up as you turn, it bites back. I wrote that on the log last week so nobody else pretended to be surprised. Tonight at 10:50, I walked the length of the low wall, counted the row markers, and clicked my mag light on to check the gasket around the door. The seal had condensation beating along it, little pearls that streaked when I touched them. Behind the tempered glass, the first meter of corridor looked like a photo. Smooth concrete, plaques set square, a brass table with a vase for flowers placed on the far end. No one visits in the night. The living have the day. The humming started when I took the key. It came up through the hinge, small and steady, and for a second I told myself it was the key ring rubbing the plaque. I've done this long enough to know when I'm lying to myself. I lifted the ring. The sound stayed faint and then it focused like someone pressed their mouth to stone. I turned the key and waited for that bite. It didn't come. The door swung inward with a hinge groan big enough to make me flinch. The motion sensor lagged almost a full second. Then the LEDs stuttered awake in a line, lighting the corridor in 3 slow bands. I hate that delay. In that moment of darkness, I always get the sense that someone is already 6 feet in and turning toward me. "Green lawn night. Open and inspect C," I said into the radio to make it a rule that I was there. Mr. Alvarez, the caretaker, hates when we go quiet. He's not on nights, but he listens more than he says. C1 through C36, I added for the record. At C17, I touched the plaque out of habit. It's set true now, but 2 months ago it had a 0.5 millimeter lip on the lower right corner that caught the cloth when Mrs. Patel wiped it down. She's our records clerk, a small woman with lilies always tied a little too tight. She had pressed the edge with her thumbnail and looked at me like I was the one who hung it crooked. The city mason came and reseated it. As I ran my finger along it tonight, it felt flush. Still, that metal smell hung stronger here. A vinegar note behind the penny. I wrote the names as I walked, quietly in case I was wrong. H. Reeves, J. Reeves, older plaques that came with the bench across the walk. Those were families who paid for their spots decades ago. The Reeves in the ledger was something else. A page from 1956 had been taped onto the new intake list during the transfer, with a 1/2 inch of yellowed margin showing. Name Reeves, first initial illegible. Origin County Facility. Disposition. Unknown, scratched out, then replaced with niche assignment C21. Then scratched out again and now in neat black city ink. C23. The day shift says the county wrote messy. I say that hand had no interest in being read. My pen rattled again. The humming rose thinly, doubled, then braiding on itself like a throat trying to sing 2 notes. It ran along the wall but seemed to prefer the lower row, level with a man's knee. I crouched and put my ear near the seam. The corridor smelled like damp concrete in that penny jar. The hum went silent the second my skin got close, like it had been holding its breath. Something had changed just beyond my light's reach. I pulled the mag light down and saw a bead of condensation tremble on the corner of C23, gather its weight, and fall through the gap in the carpet strip, straight to the drain. I don't like watching water find a path inside stone buildings. A crisp tap sounded behind me. When plastic hits stone, it has a thin, quick ring, and I knew the sound without turning. Because every night we sweep up silk flower stems that break where they slot into those little green spikes. I turned anyway. The brass table at the far end held a vase with silk lilies, and one of them had shifted. Its plastic leaf touched the table edge and made that neat tap, the way it does when the air moves and everything that used to be alive pretends again. I radioed. C corridor inspected. Motion sensor lag on entry now steady. Unknown vibration present. I didn't write humming. If you write humming in a city ledger, you get a phone call. If you write vibration, Luis gets a call, and I trust him more than whoever signs checks for Walmart. On the way out, I heard footsteps on gravel beyond the columbarium wall. They didn't sync to mine, and that's always the first way you know you're not alone. I stood still. The gravel kept going for 3 steps and then stopped hard, like whoever had been walking had remembered to be quiet. The wall runs chest high and is capped with smooth limestone. I leaned over, no one. Gravel looks flat until you make yourself look for the prints. We get raccoons and teens, and you learn the difference. This was a man's boot. The toe had a welt and the sole left square-edged blocks with a little crosshatch. I stared too long because I knew the tread. Gomez, one of the grounds crew, wears a pair that leaves that exact square. He walks with his toes slightly out and steps heavy. It's his joke. He says he was born with iron in his shoes. I radioed him out of habit even though he'd clocked off at 4. Gomez, you on property? Static. Then Alvarez. Negative. Gomez at home, why? No question mark in his voice. He talks like he's writing it down as he says it. Thought I heard the cart, I said. Because naming the wrong thing sometimes satisfies the air. I rubbed my thumb and forefinger together. The tips felt slick, as if I'd handled a fresh penny. I locked C. The Yale caught on the first turn and made that bite that hurts your hand even when you expect it. Pull up on the handle, turn, and it seats, but only if you believe the door wants to be shut. I clicked the chain through the exterior latch and made myself say, "Secure," under my breath. It's a habit my sister jokes about. Talking to locks like they're animals. You do nights long enough and everything gets a personality. On my way down the slope toward Section K, the angle changes, and you can hear Spur 5 as a low ocean. Our south fence gets the wash of traffic, and it folds into wind if the night's right. I like that part because it keeps the silence from turning brittle. I was writing the time at the plot map box when the little brass bell on the chapel eave tugged 3 times. We don't use that bell. It's decorative now, but there's still a rope inside the watch house that leads up through the ceiling. Older folks remember when families would post someone to sit the night for the first hours after burial. A ritual more than a job, a way to listen in case the ground hiccuped and the dead needed the living to keep count. I stood where I was and looked up the slope at the chapel. 1 tug can be a possum or the rope settling. 3 is a pattern. Alvarez has a rule for patterns. Pay attention when repetition shows up where it shouldn't. I climbed back. As I passed the tool shed, the steel blower leaned where Gomez leaves it. Its fuel line had been replaced and a bit of clear tube stuck out past the clamp like a tongue. Across from the chapel, the watch house leaned harder than the plans say it should. It's the kind of building that remembers boots. The rope came down in the corner and the end had been tied off with a knot that had loosened into an elegant nest. I put 2 fingers under it and felt the fibers drink sweat. The rope twitched harder than the wind and tugged another time, all weight and no ceremony. The bell answered with a single flat ring. It takes effort to move that rope on purpose. I backed out and circled the chapel. Between stones, something shuffled fast and stopped. I kept my light up and my radio quiet. An eyelash of mist crossed the beam and disappeared before I could decide if I'd seen it. The air smelled like old coins and lilies wrapped too tight. Luis keyed my radio before I did. "You get my strip stutter out there?" he asked, voice calm because he knew he was talking into silence. "Had a lag on entry," I said. "And I've got vibration near C, might be wall hum." "I'm on my way," he said. "Don't open unless you see me." He always says that and then jogs anyway, keys clacking on his belt. He's the only person I want coming up behind me on nights like this. By the time I got back to the columbarium, he was already crouched by the door. His glasses had fogged and he'd pushed them to his forehead. He held his little non-contact voltage tester like a cigarette. It flashed and beeped at the hinge when he touched it, then behaved when he pulled away. "Residual induction," he said as if he believed it. "We transferred Reeves to C-23, I said, to fill the air with facts. Ledger shows 3 changes. You saw the page," he grimaced. "That page was already taped once when I copied it," he said. "You ever see county ink pool like that? It ran up, like it was trying to leave the paper." He reached for the handle. "You going to open, or am I going to make you ask me twice?" I pulled up on the handle. The lock yielded with a damp click. This time, the motion sensor turned the LEDs on faster, as if Luis's presence counted as persuasion. We went in, my light low, his tester held out like a dowsing rod. The humming started thin and angry the second the door shut behind us. It ran along the lower row, level with a man's knee, and settled at C23. Luis crouched. "You hear that, right?" he asked. The way a person asks if the sky looks blue to everyone else. He tapped the nameplate with his knuckle. The hum cut off. I thought that was the end of it until it started again, but from the seam of C21, then 22, traveling to 23 in a slow, deliberate pass. He looked at me and mouthed the word count. I pushed my notebook into his hand and stepped to the drain. The grate was clean. It's a 6x6 square of cast iron set into the slab, meant to pull condensation toward the low point because these galleries breathe strange at night. The penny smell gathered like a puddle of air. The first drip fell where my boot toe had darkened the concrete. It landed dead center in the grid, and when I think about it now, my stomach still lifts because water doesn't aim. That drop had waited for my foot. "Stop," I said, and I don't know who I meant it for. The LEDs gave a soft relay click and the light flickered in a way that had nothing to do with voltage. Luis held his tester against the seam of C23. The tool stayed quiet. In the silence, the bell up the slope gave one slow ring. He looked toward the door. "That's outside the circuit," he said, which is how electricians say they're out of solutions. I reached to wipe the condensation from the corner of the plate because I'm an idiot. My glove slipped on damp brass and my finger slid into the seam until concrete pinched my knuckle. There's not enough space to break skin, but the cold of it bit so deep it jolted my arm. The humming cut out everywhere at once. We stood with our breath loud in our ears. The air settled. He took my hand and looked at the glove. "You good," he said, because good is a category you can control. He stared at the name. The letters on the plaque were not new. Green lawn engraves deeper than the private cemeteries do, and the black fill holds even when the sun hits it hard. Reeves had the crisp edges of a recent job, and in the reflection of my light I could see a micro scratch across the second E that hadn't been there when I checked the plate last week. A person had touched this with a ring. Mrs. Patel doesn't wear one on her right hand. "Do you hear boots?" he asked quietly. I did. Gravel outside. 1, 2, stop. 3, 4, stop. The pacing you hear when you guard a gate and your shift's almost over. It ran past the wall and halted where the corner posts meet. 5 plots to the bend. The place where a man could stand and look into the corridor if he had reason enough to stare into other people's endings. Luis put the tester in his pocket. He's not a cop or a priest, but his shoulders squared like both at once. "Keep your light steady," he said, and we went out. The Yale drummed under my hand as if the door wasn't part of a wall, but part of an animal that might choose to let us go. On the gravel, each print had softened at the edges, as if a thin film had covered them and then evaporated. The toe splayed outward. Square blocks with little crosshatch. Luis bent and kissed his teeth. "Gomez," he said, soundless. "Gomez clocked out," I said. "You saw him." "He waved when he left." "He wears those boots," Luis said. "He leaves that print. He also leaves a radio that never turns off because he sleeps with it next to his head." He tapped his ear. "We call," he answers. "We didn't call." We followed the prints toward K because that is the direction a man faces if he wants to walk the longest aisle before he decides to turn around. We passed the watch house. The rope lay slack again, the knot perfected itself. The bell waited like a coin in a palm. Halfway down K you can see the perimeter road that circles the low ground, and tonight its asphalt looked wet, though the sky had stayed clear. That happens sometimes when the humidity sits heavy. The path of boot prints crossed it, crisp even on tar, which shouldn't be possible if you spend your life telling yourself you believe in physics. Luis stopped where the road meets the path to the caretaker's cottage. His keys pressed into his hip under his belt. "We're going to the office," he said. "I need to finish C," I said without meaning it. "We're going to the office because that's where the ledger is, and you're going to show me the scratch-outs with your exact nice pen." His humor sounded like a plank across mud. The office sits right on the cemetery line. A little brick if you look from the path. Bigger in the way it smells like paper and people who try to be careful. We didn't leave the grounds. The lamp above the door burns a sodium orange that makes every moth look like a leaf. I unlocked the door and flipped the switch. Fluorescent hummed and made the air look cheaper than outside. As I closed the door, the bell tugged again once, audible even through glass. We both flinched like children who heard their name in another room. On the desk, the transfer ledger lay where Mrs. Patel leaves it. Right side weighted with a stapler to keep the paper from curling in the humidity. The Reeves page looked exactly like it had when I described it. Taped margin, pooled ink that had run up, assignment scratched from C21 to C23 with one hard line and one light, as if someone had changed their mind while they were changing their mind. Luis leaned over my shoulder. He has a scar in his right eyebrow that splits the hair, and when he concentrates it turns white against his skin. "You see this line?" he said, touching the margin where the tape had bubbled. "Old tape pulls the top layer of paper. This didn't. The bubble lifted the edge, but the fibers are intact. You know what that means." "That whoever taped it damp pressed it later," I said. "That whoever taped it never left this paper alone long enough for it to dry on its own," he said. He looked at me. "Reeves had a number at the county." "Did we copy it?" I pointed. Under the name, in faint gray pencil, a notation, BR05. Those letters show up on county lots from back when they logged prison burials as batches. BR stands for block row or burial run, depending on who you ask. We had 10 like that in the transfer. They're no one to the city, but to the state they were once counted like a shipment. I pulled the phone list and found the number for the night sergeant at the police district that covers us. "We don't call for noises. We call for papers. Sergeant Tran is short on patience for ghosts and long on patience for locked doors," he answered with a tired voice and no greeting. I said my name and my job and that I needed confirmation of a disposition change on a transfer. He paused long enough for my shoulders to feel heavy. "Date," he said. "Transfer June 12, I said. "Notation corrected June 20. Reeves initial incomplete. County lot reported as BR05. We have him in C23. He clicked his tongue. Keys clacked on his end. "I see the file. Correction due to niche availability," he said. "Which is the way paper talks about moving a person." He cleared his throat. "Also note, the Reeves group were the ones discovered under the east fence line. The contractor pulled those from a poured footing. Marked in file as significant disturbance to footings due to heavy weather. You folks had a hard time of it that week." Luis cut his eyes at me. He walked to the window and looked at the slope. "We're fine," I said to the sergeant, because some things like to be told they are even when they're not. We hung up before he asked the question he wanted to ask, which is whether the bell meant anything to anyone anymore. Luis didn't turn. He stood with his hand against the glass like he wanted to feel vibration. "You're going to hate this," he said. "But we have to open C23 again. Then C21, then C22. His voice was even and thin, the way it gets when his humor burns off and the engineer shows. I didn't argue. We went back with the ledger under my arm because facts are the only weapon we're allowed. The yard air felt heavier, like a storm was rehearsing. The bell stayed still, but the rope twitched once in a way my body picked up more than my eyes. The boot prints on the perimeter road looked newer. That is not a sentence I should be able to write. At the door, the Yale didn't bite. It swung like it wanted us in. The LEDs lit as if we were prey that obliged them. We went to C23 first. Luis touched his tester to the seam. No beep. He put both hands on the edges of the nameplate and drew a breath like a swimmer. "Don't you dare," I said, but I didn't stop him. He tested the play. Plates don't have play. This one sang under his fingers, a thin, glassy note inside the concrete. He withdrew his hands like he'd touched a stove. The humming stopped everywhere at once again, as if it were embarrassed to have been heard. C21, he said, and we moved left. The nameplate here belonged to a man with a different last name, but the same first initial. That happens. Initials repeat. Still, BR05 echoed in my head. He tested the seam. Silence. We moved to 22. The tester chirped once and stopped. He turned the tool over as if it had insulted him. "It's not power," he said. "It's something using the wall to count." The bell rang. 3 slow pulls spaced like a patient man with a heavy arm. We both looked up even though there was nothing to see. When we looked back down, the condensation on C23 had scrolled a vertical line along the second E, a thin, cold trail that made the letter look like a signature dragged downward by a shaky hand. My light caught the track, and for a second I saw my own face, small and distorted, and behind it the corridor's length, and in the reflection a dark figure at the far end that could have been me, could have been both of us, could have been a trick of light. "Pick one," Luis said. "We're not staying." I chose a procedure I could live with. "We lock and mark," I said. We logged the hum as vibration and the bell as mechanical fault. We note the condensation as condensation, and we go sit at the gate until shift change because that is what the book tells us to do when the night asks us to count for it. He nodded, because he likes rules almost as much as he pretends he doesn't. On the way out, I turned to the drain. A small coin lay on the grid. It shone dull, as if it had been there a long time and also as if it had arrived just now. I didn't touch it. We don't leave offerings in municipal buildings. We call them tripping hazards. I left it where it was because picking it up would have been the same as admitting I understood who left it. We stepped out and pulled the door. The Yale bit hard, belligerent again. I lifted the handle and turned until the cylinder seated. Secure, I said, and this time I didn't laugh at myself. We took the perimeter road to the gate. The heavy steps paced us on gravel, falling just behind and to the side like a man with a duty he resents. We didn't look because that is how he keeps his dignity. At the gatehouse, we sat on the bench and listened to the traffic comb the edge of the night. Luis rubbed his fingers together without noticing and then wiped them on his jeans. He had the penny smell on his hands. He didn't say it. I didn't either. Around 3, the air changed. Nights have a pivot when even the insects agree to rest their wings. The fog that hadn't been there lifted off the grass in a low ribbon that caught the sodium light and turned it the color of apricots. I did a last walk of the interior path where it meets Section K because I'm stupid, and because I like to be the one who writes the thing down instead of the one who hears it second. At the bend, I found a line of coins on the low stone border. Not a pile, not a careless handful. A line, edge to edge, nicked faces up, each one placed where a boot might pause if a man were counting the last feet of a shift. They were state pennies, different years. Most worn to the point where the numbers bit the skin when you ran a thumb over them. At the very end of the line, a newer one gleamed where a droplet had polished half the face in the shape of a thumbprint. I took out the ledger and wrote, 14 coins placed along border at K Bend. Unknown person. Vibration ceased at approximately 3:15. Bell activity ceased. I didn't write humming. I didn't write boots. I closed the book so my skin could forget the weight of the pen. When the crows came and the east fence line turned black with their backs, Alvarez arrived with his thermos. He stands like a man who remembers standing in lines. He tipped his head at the gate as if we should be able to feel the day through it. Anything I should know, he said without looking at us. LED lag, I said. Condensation heavier than usual. Coil hum at C corridor. Rope on the chapel loose again. We secured it, he nodded. He poured coffee and didn't drink it. Luis said, we might have a resonance issue through the lower row. I'll file something. Alvarez grunted. He watched a crow hop down onto a grave border, peck at the moss and hop off. You ever hear that prison used to make men walk the fence line before dawn? He said to the ground. Counting, they called it. Kept them out of trouble or put them in it. I said nothing. Luis said nothing. The bell did not ring. The wind rose like a suggestion made by someone polite. At 7, Mrs. Patel came in with her lilies. She wrapped them too tight and they held their shape like paper hats. She placed one at the brass table in C corridor. She never notices us when she's doing that part of her morning. It's not rudeness. It's respect for the room she is entering. She came out, set the vase from the table aside, and reached into her cardigan pocket. She drew out a small roll of tape and pressed a corner down on the ledger page where the Reeves margin had lifted overnight. She smoothed it with 2 fingers, patient and firm. It was lifting, she said, not looking up. I nodded. Luis looked at me and then at the page. The tape held the margin down flat, the bubble gone. Under the tape, the pooled county ink looked as if it had never moved. Some things decide to be readable again when morning is near. We clocked out. I walked to my car along the alley that runs the length of the fence. My boots made their own sound on the dust. The wind carried the road as a soft, far instrument. On the other side of the fence, a delivery truck downshifted. Cardboard slid in a stacked chorus and a man cursed once, exasperated and ordinary. The world past the low wall arranged itself like a store that hadn't opened yet. If I ever end up doing this until I'm the person who knows where the old keys live, I'll tell the new kid to write vibration when he hears humming. I'll tell him to watch the rope, not the bell, and to look for coins where the road invites a man to pause. I'll tell him the humming will start where a knee would rest if a man knelt to tie his boot, and that it will stop when he listens too closely. Because listening too closely is a kind of answer. I'll also tell him the one thing I learned last. This morning, when I passed the columbarium on my way out, the condensation trail on C-23's second E had dried. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't see it at all. The tiny line curved right at the bottom, the way a man's hand does when he signs his name without meaning to. And when I stopped and stood where the boot prints always halt, 5 plots to the bend, the humming lifted like breath in a throat and settled again, as if counting me with everything else that belongs to the grounds. The bell rope twitched once in the chapel, and the sound staggered out across the headstones. Somewhere near Section H, the soil sighed like a damp lung. I stood by the iron fence with keys in my fist and watched fog climb the marble like pale fingers, listening for a second tug. I'm 34. Night security for the old Laurel Grove Annex, the city cemetery that backs right up against the bypass construction. They hired me after the third collapse on the new spur. Surveyors blamed soft clay and old brick vaults. The archive said a potter's field once spread here, then was relocated. That word stuck like grit in a tooth. Tonight, the crew lights on the highway were dead and the traffic a mile off sounded like the ocean folding in on itself. My shift started at 10. Deshawn relieved me at 4, or was supposed to, unless the city radioed to keep someone on for dawn inspections. Mrs. Ellery from Records had pressed a brass key into my palm earlier and said, "If anyone tugs, check the receiving vault, not the chapel. The rope runs through." Then she adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan, the one with a snag near the cuff, and told me again to keep a log. I always kept a log. I made my first round with a mag light and the small clipboard, calling out times on my two-way, letting dispatch hear I was moving. Southgate secure. Perimeter road clear. Mausoleum corridor lights on. The LED strips in the municipal columbarium always stuttered at night, like they resented the motion sensors. I wrote it down and told myself I'd call building maintenance in the morning. It was one of those habits, like Deshawn cracking sunflower seeds with neat clicks as he walked the rows. By Section D, the ground dipped where construction trucks had rumbled past all summer. The city had propped the fence with temporary braces. I tested the chain slide in the Southgate latch and it sang a thin ringing tone. Beyond it, the highway's white lines looked straight under the fog, but the lines like to trick you near dawn. Near midnight, I cut through the chapel yard. The bell cord hung against the wall, twisted a quarter turn like someone had released it halfway. "Wind," I said out loud, though the air was heavy and still. I logged it. My recorder hissed for a second and cleaned itself the way old radios do. The first small thing was a name. On a headstone 3 rows in from the toolshed path, a fresh granite marker read Trowel. I remembered the plot, a 1960s burial transferred from the old field when the new freeway went in. But Trowel was supposed to sit between Hinojosa and Strout. The map in my pocket had Trowel banished to the far end of row 18. I flashed the beam and checked the little row marker nailed into the edging. Board 18, I checked. Again, 18. The map didn't match. I made a note, circle and arrow. My handwriting looked smaller than usual. I used the grave probe once when I shouldn't have. It's a long, thin rod with a T-handle, meant to feel for voids before digging. We keep it by the shed door. I probed near Trowel and felt metallic drag against brick at 12 inches. Not unusual here with the old vaults. When I left the rod leaning against the shed, the wind caught the shed's tin roof edge and made it clack. Wind, I told myself again. The Spanish moss hung dead still. At 12:40 a.m., Gomez rolled up in his county truck to check the braces on the fence. He swung down, boots leaving square prints, and clicked his flashlight twice as he always did. He looked toward the highway and said, "They found another line of vaults under the median. Mrs. Ellery sent me a copy." He tapped the clipboard on my chest. "Your map's too clean." "I keep it tidy," I said. "The ground remembers messy." He spit to the dirt, then nodded toward the bell tower. "You get tugs?" "Just one." I didn't mention the twist. He raised his shoulders under his jacket. "Call if it's 3. Then he went humming something tuneless and checked his braces, the steel groaning once under his wrench. By 1, a fine mist thickened the fog so the headlamp cone of my maglite caught beads in the air. Air tasted like coins. I swung past the columbarium. Above the small square doors, each etched with dates and dashes, the motion sensors blinked awake one by one like eyes opening. They lagged half a second. I logged it. The second small thing was dampness where it didn't belong. Under the marble step of the receiving vault, the concrete stayed dry even in rain. Tonight, a dark line crept from the crack between riser and tread, threading across the threshold and into the gravel. I touched it with my glove, and my fingers came away smelling like nails and vinegar. That's when the bell tugged twice in a row, not hard, but like someone fumbled for a rhythm. I said, "Hold on to nobody," and slid the brass key into the vault lock. It's an old Yale rim, polished smooth from use, and the bitting on the key is worn like a cat's teeth. The turn stuck, as if a shoulder leaned from the other side. I leaned back. The door gave a little, enough to breathe a cold breath across my knees. I didn't open it then. I shut it, relocked, and walked a circle around the chapel to see if a line had snapped somewhere. The rope ran through an elbow and down into the vault's corner. You can't reach it from above without taking up floorboards, and nobody but records authorizes that. At 1:30, I called Deshaun on the private channel to break the monotony. He answered with a crack and a laugh. "You hearing our long lost? Seeds are stale tonight." "2 tugs," I said. "Tell her to wait until I'm there. I'll tell her about the Falcons." He liked to needle the dead with football talk. "You want coffee? I'll bring a thermos." "Yeah," I said. "No sugar? Like you have blood to sweeten?" He clicked off, leaving a rush of static that faded slow. I took my breath paragraph by the south path. On the low border wall, Mrs. Patel had left lilies wrapped too tight. The plastic cellophane squeaked as it adjusted to humidity. The squeak sounded like tiny wheels rolling on marble, and for a second I pictured a dolly under a coffin, wood creaking, men in dark suits steering through doorways that were not quite wide enough. I adjusted the lilies to ease the strain, and the squeak softened. Doing the small kindness felt like touching the real, and I needed that. On my next pass, graffiti shimmered on the perimeter wall where the fog beaded the spray paint. It wasn't new. I knew the hand. But the E in the tag curved now like a loop closing into itself. It made a ring. I put my palm against the brick and felt vibration. Not from trucks, but like breath in a pipe. I made a note and wrote too hard, tearing the paper at the edge. The tear irritated me more than the ring. At 2:05, the third small thing came as a sound. A beetle tapped in a plastic vase on a nearby stone, regular as a metronome. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the insect that bothered me. It was the way the taps counted off too neat, matching the lag of the LEDs in the columbarium. 2 lags, then 3. My radio hissed again, and I could hear dispatch half say my name, then fade. I turned up the volume and got nothing but my own breath. I passed the caretaker's house where the property line kisses the cemetery fence. The window over the sink glowed blue. Father Orloff had moved in temporarily while the rectory was gutted for mold. He coughed and cleared his throat in the mornings like he was scraping up gravel. He wasn't there tonight. A note on the gate said he would be at the bishop's until Friday. The note fluttered a little, no wind. The paper fluttered anyway. Near 3, the sodium lamps on the perimeter road fuzzed halo around each post. The fog had climbed the magnolias to smear the leaves. I re-anchored my time, checked my watch, and told myself I had an hour and a half to go. Manufactured numbers comfort me. I made one more sweep along the fence where the highway shouldered close. So close you could throw a stone onto the highway's grass if you wanted. That was when I saw the highway's white line curve. Not a trick of angle. It curved away from its own lane, veering toward the far shoulder and then back like someone had laid it over an old oval footprint and the paint wanted to please the shape beneath. The curve matched the circular plot map I'd seen in the archive, the ring that marked the original Potter's Field when burials were cheap and quick. I told myself to log it. I forgot to lift the pencil. I went straight from that site to the chapel, locking the south gate as I went because procedure matters when your chest goes light. The bell rope hung now facing me, not twisted, just straight and waiting. I took the brass key again and slid it into the vault. If there's a responsible action in a place built for responsible endings, it's this. You open the door that someone on the other side is pulling. The vault door swung inward on a hinge that protested in 3 notes. I angled my light down the steps. The air was cold enough to catch my breath in small clouds. The concrete treads were damp, shining like the backs of old gray fish. The rope threaded into the corner, then through a hole into the ceiling where the bell sat embedded in the chapel loft. I could hear drip on marble in the far end. I took the first step with care, remembering how Mrs. Ellery had told me to feel with the outside edge of my boot. If the edge goes, you can still fall forward, she'd said, tidying a stack of permits, instead of backward into the handrail. She has tidy hands. They make tidiness seem brave. Halfway down the steps, the humming started. It came up through my boot soles, the way a refrigerator hums in an empty house that suddenly feels occupied. The hum was not electrical. It was earth around brick, resonant, as if the pressure from above had settled into the older void, making a low singing. I wanted to tell myself it was traffic. Traffic does not sing in that key. At the bottom, the vault opened into a rectangular room with arches eaten by efflorescence. The city had kept it swept. A rack for boards leaned to one side, old wood labeled with numbers from the days when they sealed unembalmed bodies in quick vaults to wait out stormwater. The catalog tags made a rattling like little knuckles when the damp got into them. The floor sloped to a grate. Under the grate, running laterally, were brick tubes like culverts, the old air channels for vaults that no longer hold names. Light from my mag light caught condensation on the nameplates of storage niches along the wall. Some were unlabeled. Some had typed cards, urn, unidentified. I tapped one and it knocked a hollow answer. My skin tightened. Something tugged the rope above my head. Once, then twice, then a third time. It wasn't hard, more like precise testing, the way you might find your balance in the dark. I turned and put my hand on the rope to steady it and found the fiber slick and cold. Up close, it smelled faintly of vinegar and steel. I could have gone back up and called dispatch with the phrase we use for major issues. I could have locked the door and waited for dawn. The hum under my boots said I had a shorter window than that. When ground talks, you listen, or you get buried in talk you can't answer. I followed the hum to the far wall where the brick tubes ran. At the junction of two vault channels, mortar had cracked in a jagged diagonal. Through the crack, fog pooled like water trapped in a shallow dish. I crouched and aimed my light into the seam. The beam ran out after only a foot. The channel beyond bent out of sight, not straight as a builder would intend, but turning in service to an older radius. I took the grave probe from where I'd carried it like a talisman and slid it into the seam. It hit nothing solid, then met brick, then nothing, as if the tube widened, then narrowed. When I pulled the rod back, the end dripped with a darkness that wasn't sludge. It was clean water with iron dissolved in it, rusty but clear. The taste of the air changed like breathing pennies. My radio crackled and delivered Deshawn's voice, small and far. "I'm by the north gate. You locked the south?" "I did," I said, and my voice bounced off marble in round echoes. "Come to the chapel. Bring the other flashlight." "On my way," he said. I heard him walking in my head, seed clicks keeping time, boots biting gravel. I had seconds before he would be there or not there. The hum grew a notch, not louder but closer, as if the old vaults were aligning under the weight of the bypass, shifting into an older pattern. I slid my hand along the brick seam to feel where pressure found relief. Under my fingertips, the mortar crumbled in a small bead. I pressed, not hard, just enough to let a sliver of brick settle back into itself. The hum paused. It was listening too. From the chapel above, 3 steps creaked. The creak had a human weight. "That you?" I called, and my call came back stale, like sound that had gone out and come home with new clothes. The bell rope loosened in my hand, and I felt the same precise testing, once, twice, then a third. The rope settled, almost like a sigh. I chose my action. I shifted my weight and set my shoulder against the brick at the seam. If the channel beyond followed a curve, I could relieve pressure by allowing the old ring to express itself. The city's ring loves to be a ring. I pushed under the point where the mortar had cracked deepest. The brick ticked. The hum dulled. Above me, the curve of the white line out on the highway uncoiled in my mind, then coiled again. "Hold it," said a voice behind me, Deshawn's. He filled the doorway with his bulk sunflower seeds in his palm. He set down the thermos and looked not at me, but at the rope. His face had the still expression he wore when teasing a stray dog. "She's got something to say," he said, soft. He took the second flashlight and arced it along the floor, careful not to blind me. "We need to ease it," I said. "Everything wants the circle." He nodded without understanding, but trusted me because I trust maps. He leaned with me into the brick, slow and steady, not a shove. Our shoulders added up to a persuasion, not a demand. The seam widened a hair and the grate burped once. The sound went down the channels and returned as a rumble under our boots. Then the pressure thinned. I breathed and tasted only damp air now, not nails. We stood back. The rope gave a final quiet twitch, just one. Deshawn looked at me, then toward the steps. "Okay," he said. "Strong coffee and a stronger complaint to maintenance." We climbed. On the chapel floor, our breaths made small ghosts. I relocked the vault, and the brass key felt warmer in my hand as if it had learned something in my pocket. Outside, the fog lay shin-high along the path. The sodium lamp behind the columbarium painted everything a soft orange. "We should log trowel," I said, habit reasserting itself like a hand smoothing hair. "We should log a lot," he said, and stretched his back until it popped. He offered me the thermos and I drank half, black and bitter. We did our false safety then. We took a slow lap, called dispatch, said the word for minor issue, not major. We told each other it was fine. It did not hold. When we reached the south fence, the temporary braces had shifted a fraction. You could put a leaf into the gap between brace and post. Gomez hadn't left it that way. At 3:40, 2 new anomalies presented like a polite invitation. A coin lay on the wrong stone, a nickel on Hinojosa when her family always left pennies for good luck. The other was a nameplate screw, rusted, lying at the base of a niche with no missing plate. "Someone checking their work?" Deshawn said, but he didn't bend to pick it up. He has rules about touching for the sake of touching. We reset our senses in the caretaker's yard, where a motion light groped for us and found us on its 3rd try. The ground flattened me there finally with a low throat-clearing growl. It wasn't the earth swallowing. It was the ground adjusting to a shape it remembered before roads drew lanes. I found myself turning my palm toward the highway like I could feel paint. "Stop," Deshawn said, pointing to my hand. He looked spooked without admitting it. "You're shaking like you got an old car idling in your fingers." We went back to the chapel. If you have a place to face a problem, you go there again and again like a dog goes to one corner of a yard to watch the street. The bell rope hung straight, no twist. The damp line under the vault door had dried to a high tide mark. "Stay up here," I said to Deshawn. "If it tugs, tell me. You're going back down?" He juggled seeds, crack crunch. Better now than when the crew is here with excuses. I didn't want Gomez under there. I wanted my weight and my shoulder because I knew the game. He leaned by the rope, hand ready but not holding. I opened the vault and went down into the cool again. The hum had changed. It was further off but sharper, like a tuning fork struck at a distance. In the crack, fog no longer pooled. Brick looked like brick, dry at the edges, damp in the middle. I pressed my palm to the seam. It held. I pressed again, firmer. Somewhere below, a brick shifted in answer and lodged in a new groove. My mind mapped rings without paper. The ring in the archive photo had a break at the east side where a gate had used to be. The highway cut that old gate in half. The pressure would always find the old break because breaks are old promises. From above, Deshawn said, "1 tug." His voice sounded careful. "I have it," I said. "2, he said. "Hold a breath." I adjusted my pressure a fingertip to the left, aligning nothing obvious, aligning something you feel because you stand on it. The hum thinned so suddenly my ears popped. My radio cleared its throat and said, "Unit 2, confirm sweep," in dispatch's bored voice. I swallowed and answered yes. 3, Deshawn said. His hand must have twitched to grab the rope and not grabbed it. He respects things that are not meant for him. I took my breath then. I sat on the step and let the chill seep through denim. I thought of Mrs. Ellery's cardigan snag, the way her hand lands on paper like a bird lands on a branch it has landed on before. She will correct the map. She won't change the ring. Rings aren't drawings. They are instructions. The danger shifted the way a chair shifts under a heavy person who decides to stand. The stress left one set of bones and climbed onto another. The vault took a long, slow breath with me. We came up to find dawn nowhere, and yet the fog had the faint blue that means morning will someday show. I checked my watch. 4:08. Deshawn said, "I'll stay until 5. He liked to pretend he was reckless and then do the solid thing. He went to check the perimeter. I went to the office to start a note for records. The cemetery office is a low building with shelves of ledgers and a small window that looks at an alley of holly trees. I set the brass key on the blotter. The pad had an imprint from a note someone had written hard. I angled the desk lamp and read the pressure marks. "Do not straighten." The words weren't for the key. They weren't for me, not any more than you could write a note to a tide. They were for the ring in the ground, though nobody in this office would admit it out loud. I made the report neat enough to pass day inspection. I listed trowel out of order. I listed the dampness at the vault and the small relief in pressure after manual adjustment. I did not write the white line bending. I did not write the 3 tugs like a slow patient instruction. I wrote, "Bell rope sounded while staff present. No unauthorized persons located." My pen made a slight squeak. At 4:30, Officer Kincaid rolled by on his early patrol. He leaned into the door and signed the log with his impossible block letters. He smelled like rain even when dry. "Heard they're rolling machines back on site tomorrow," he said. "You boys keep your heads." "Keep your lanes," I said, and he laughed like a dog who recognizes a whistle. We took our last breath. The fog thinned to show the magnolia trunks, and in that new visibility I saw it. The small brass tags on the board rack in the vault below had numbers stamped in sequence. Through the floor, memory served me their order. The numbers turned around the rack, not straight down. They turned in a ring. I hadn't noticed the ring in the way the rack presented, because the rack let you pretend it was a line. When the dayman came, he would check the braces and the crew would return with their new math, saying they'd calculated for the subsidence. The earth smiles at math but obeys obligation. It likes where the poor were laid. It doesn't allow erasures without blur. I locked the chapel and the south gate and stood a long minute with my forehead against the cool iron. Behind me, the bell rope hung unmoving. I thought about the highway line and about how a painter might lay it down again tomorrow. Bright white stripe insisting on straightness over a patient curve. The ring would welcome it back either way, as circles do. As I walked to hand the brass key to Mrs. Ellery later that morning, the humming was gone. The soil had settled for now. When I reached the office door, she was there in her cardigan, smoothing a paper. "Did she call?" she asked, meaning the rope. "She did," I said. She nodded once like she'd expected that answer for years, and placed her tidy hand on the key. "Don't straighten," she said, almost to herself, tracing a loop on the blotter without looking. We ruin more with straightening. The first truck on the bypass sounded its reverse alarm, the slow tone folding into the day. The bell did not ring, not then. Only when I left for the week and locked the south gate a final time, the chain sliding and singing its thin note, did I hear a small tug from the chapel. Just one, a simple check-in. The rope settled back with a soft brush. The sound was like a paint line adjusting under fog. I locked the key into its box and heard the faintest second tug, delayed in the wood as if the timbers remembered what to do. Then nothing, except the curve waiting under the straight. Soil hissed under the chapel eaves as if the ground had a throat and finally cleared it. The bell rope moved once against its own weight, a soft brush against wood. I thought it was the wind, except the air was dull and wet, heavy enough to stick my jacket to my forearms. I was 34, the night security at Laurel Ridge Cemetery, the Victorian garden layout on the edge of Gettysburg. Just down the slope from the soldiers' graves that school buses visit every spring, we had our own chapel, our own columbarium, and a short ridge of older family plots that backed straight against a cedar fence. I took the job because nights are quiet and keys behave. Things lock, lights come on, routine settle. That week, the new resort had opened across the stone wall on the far perimeter road, the one that used to mark the old battlefield line. They put cabins on piers to keep from disturbing history, their words, not mine. My boss called it a partnership. I called it everyone, forgetting why we drew boundaries. I started rounds at 9:20. Sodium lamps pooled in the lanes like pale soup. The drizzle was the kind that never fell but collected on everything. I logged the gates, ran my hand along the heavy chain at north, then swung by the tool shed to check the steel blower was locked and the Fisker's loppers hung from the nailboard. I liked tapping the Yale rim locks with my knuckle, hearing that dull answer. It meant the night would be ordinary. At 10:05, I cut across Section D because a maintenance flag had been left standing near a granite obelisk. Flags mean the crew has work pending, settlement, edging, sometimes a reset if frost heave splits the bedding. I expected damp clay, a measuring rod, and nothing else. What I found was a rectangle of darker soil with tiny glass shards embedded in it, like grit that caught the light. No footprints in or out, though Gomez always left square heel prints when he rushed and he had been on day shift. I bent, touched the soil with a gloved finger and found it springy as if air lay under it. The ground can do that after rain, but the drizzle had only started at dusk. 2 cabins at the resort burned warm on the rise. I could see people moving across windows, wine glasses lifted, silhouettes turning. I stood, looked back at the flag again, and the bell rasped inside the chapel, 3 slow pulls. "We never pull it after 9, No funerals at night, no vigils, not in this place. I lifted my radio out of habit, thumbed the button, then put it down. The chapel was 30 yards away. If someone wanted help, I could arrive faster than Mara could answer. The chapel door had an old brass key that lived on my second ring. The bitting was worn to a smooth tongue. My keys had weight I trusted. I swung the door and let the wet air slide in. The motion sensor in the anteroom lagged, then flicked the LEDs once, twice. The corridor to the altar smelled like old wood and vinegar. I have smelled metal all my life, but this had a bite. The kind of tang you get when someone keeps a bucket of rusty nails under a sink. There were votive racks for daytime visitors unlit. A bell rope hung from a yoke in an alcove near the back. It was still. Nobody was inside. I traced the ceiling with the flashlight and checked each pew. I checked the sacristy even though we handle supplies, not sacraments. The window there is a narrow slit that points toward the hill. A bead of water gathered and fell on the sill. When I closed the sacristy door, the rope brushed my shoulder. I took a step back. It moved again, slow and careful. A child's drag under a sheet 1, 2, 3 across the wood. The sound carried under the rafters and into the aisle. I pressed my palm to the rope. It was steady. No draft reached it. The chapel is a sealed box unless you open both doors, and I had not. I went out into the drizzle and circled the exterior, scanning the baseboards, checking for signs that a raccoon had found a way under. The stone foundation was tight. My radio chirped. "You at the chapel?" Mara said. You could always hear her thermos cap click when she spoke. She kept it screwed halfway so she could recork fast between calls. Board noticed motion. The sensor pinged twice. "I just passed under it," I said. "All quiet." "Good. Mr. Whitaker called earlier about the permit file for tomorrow. He left his cough on my voicemail again. He says the resort wants a sunrise ash scattering. Told him we don't do ad hoc ceremonies. He said they're adjacent grounds, not our jurisdiction." I looked at the cabins on the ridge. Their deck lights were halos in the wet. "Not our jurisdiction," I said, "and Sam?" She added, "You still have the north duplicate on your ring?" "On me." "Good. We mislogged a key 2 weeks ago and Whitaker's still arch about it. He's arch about everything. Treat the chapel like a cat. If you catch it doing something, pretend you saw nothing." "Copy," I said, but the rope noise had not left my ears. At 10:30, I stopped by the office. The caretaker house where we keep the safe and the ledgers. The house abuts the back gate and smells like floor polish and coffee burned into the hot plate. I pulled the key log and glanced at the chapel entry. My initials were there, neat from 8:59. A thin line of water had drawn itself under the door, a snail trail from someone's umbrella. Mrs. Patel had stopped by before closing with lilies wrapped too tight, and she always left a wet crescent by the threshold. I imagined her knuckles fussing, her quiet voice asking if she could tuck a ribbon into a niche just this once. I had said yes, then watched her walk the border road with her flowers cupped like a bird. I stared at the ledger and saw it. Across 6 columns of completed permits, 2 names repeated, one in every 5th row, always as a middle name, always with the same date. I blinked and realized I was reading too fast. The ink had bled slightly in the wet air and the J looked like an I. The date was a birth year, not a death date. I shut the book, reminded myself not to chase patterns at night. False alarm, I told myself, and I believed it for 3 minutes. The next rounds took me along the columbarium wall. Niches run to waist height there, brushed aluminum plates with little screws that want you to strip them. I wiped condensation off row C as a courtesy, because the cold brings water into lettering and it sets strange. The plates hummed under my glove in a way my head didn't like, a sympathetic vibration from the road beyond the hedge. Distant truck tires made the air throb every so slightly, and the screws sang against each other. Halfway down row C, slot 14, a coin sat on the ledge. People leave coins sometimes. The trick is the coin should match the branch or the tradition. Pennies for thought, quarters for service, nickels for a childhood joke. This was an old silver dime, slick with years, pressed under the screw head where the tiny slot had a burr. I slid it free. It smelled like the chapel rope. I put the dime in my pocket and marked the niche number in the maintenance notebook I keep clipped in my jacket. I pressed the plate for good measure. It flexed a hair and settled. I heard shovels from the far side of the ridge. Nobody digs at night. It is a rule we say out loud on staff days so everyone nods. The day crew leaves the grave probe and the trowels hung up. and if a service runs over, we wait until dawn to reset the turf. I killed my light and stood with the drizzle pattering my hat brim. The sound came as 3 careful scrapes, then the soft lift of a blade through wet clay. It came from Section H, where the old family stones lean out of habit and the ground gives under boots after a hard rain. There are 2 widened paths there, barely car width, where we tow the compressor for setting work. You hear every pebble your soul picks up. I crossed the lane and found nothing. A mound of surplus soil under a tarp breathed water. It always breathes when the rain rolls off the tarp edge and hits the mound in a slow drumbeat. I held my breath and counted. The air tasted like penny water. By 11:15, I had convinced myself the sound was runoff. I cut back toward the chapel because that felt like where the night had left a question mark. From the west, the resort had gone quieter. Someone walked along their railing and set a wine glass down with a ringing note, and for a second that note rode the air through the fence, thin and cheerful, in a way the cemetery could not answer. I watched the figure pause, hand at their ear like they were listening to something else. They went inside. The bell rope gave 3 soft tugs that I felt in my teeth. I put my hand on the brass key again. Keys are language. They translate your intent into action. I unlocked the chapel a second time and stepped in with my light low. The LEDs flickered once. The aisle smelled more acidic than before, like someone had cut a lemon over iron. The rope hung a finger's width from the wall. It did not move. "Cat," I said to humor Mara and checked the crawlspace hatch near the altar base. The hatch is for the organ pump service. It's not a space meant for people. The screws on its plate were stiff from swelling, and when I eased it up, the humidity hit my face like a cupboard full of wet rags. Below there was a narrow channel between joists, a speckled concrete basin that collected condensation. No footprints, no fur. A spider had built a net between 2 nail points and there were beads of water on its lines. I closed it before my light drew attention. The bell rope shrugged against my sleeve. The office line rang. I stepped through the arch to answer and found Mara already on the radio. "Guest called the county service," she said. "Resort cabin heard something like marching. They think a reenactor troupe is lost. You want to swing the perimeter while I call Whitaker and get ahead of it?" "On it," I said, grateful for a task with edges. Marching underpinned the town. People heard things all the time. Gravel can read his boots when you are looking for company. I swept the perimeter road from the south gate to the Cedars. The fence line there shared a stone wall with the resort boundary. That wall was older than my grandfather. You could smell it after rain, a chalk that got in your throat. The resort's lamps made bars through the trees. Shadows moved like they were late. I stopped where the road narrowed and leaned my light across the wall. Footprints on our side were mine and Gomez's and the shaped ovals of Mrs. Patel's flats. On the resort side, under their deck stairs, the soil had the same spring as the rectangle by the flag. Fresh, dark, and set toward sinking. I heard boots again, but they were particular. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. Like someone testing planks or counting off a rope. At midnight, I went back to the caretaker house. Mara was there with her thermos and a packet of peanuts she broke into 2 piles to give her hand something to do. "Whitaker is awake," she said. "He claims partnership again. Says their board asked him to keep us flexible because history is a living thing. His cough is getting worse." "Was it marching?" I asked, "or did they hear the rope?" "Rope?" She looked up. "Bell rope," I said. 3 tugs, twice. She unscrewed the thermos cap and inhaled steam. "You know the story they tell about that bell. Doctors line to the old caretaker house, blizzards, caretakers napping. They love to think the desperate could flag a night watch. It's a good story," I said. "I'm not looking for one tonight." "Then do what you do. Touch your locks, walk your lines, ignore the theater. Call me if the living appear." We did the rounds together once for morale. At the columbarium, Mara ran her finger along row C and muttered about the hum. "Traffic," she said. "Or the compressor in the shed is doing that sympathetic singing. I hate it when machines pretend they have voices." At the chapel, we both stood with our backs to the door and watched. Nothing moved. The rope looked like it had always been there. "False safety," she said, not unkindly, like she was marking it in her own head. "Don't say that," I said. But she was right. You cannot declare normal because you want it. Night work rewards the honest. At 12:40, we separated. She took the office calls and the gate camera feed. I took the northeast section where the old family plots turned the road tight. The rain settled into a more committed fall. My jacket began to wick through. I could feel the damp under my beanie and the prickle against my neck where hair escapes and becomes a wick of its own. I kept my headlamp low to watch for borders and edges. Stones trip you if you forget they own the ground. A little red light blinked under a bench near the veterans section. For a second, I thought someone had left a candle stub with an LED core. Those battery votives that turn the color of nursery floors. I crouched and found a motion sensor puck, the kind landscapers use to trip path lights. It was stuck to the underside of the bench with painter's tape. No brand name. The battery was new. When I shifted it into my palm, the coin I had pocketed clicked against it. The puck was tuned to catch a knee passing, not a foot. It had been placed to watch visitors who sit too long and fold their hands around their own knees when they think. The chapel rope tugged once, twice, 3 times in my head, or maybe the real rope did, and the rain ate the sound. By 1:10 I was angry. At myself, at the resort, at the way rain makes 2 things into one. I radioed Mara and said, "We've got unauthorized sensors on cemetery benches. That's not board approved. That's not anything approved." "Copy," she said. "Take one to show Whitaker. Leave the rest. Better proof that way." "Who places motion pucks in a cemetery at night?" I asked. There was a little bite to my voice I tried to sand down. "People who sell experiences," she said, "or people who want evidence that life goes on when the living go to bed." "Are they branded?" "No." "Then maybe they're ours without being ours." "Helpful," I said, but her caution felt like a hand on my sleeve. I cut back across section D because it nested my irritation into something to touch. The maintenance flag still leaned. The darker soil still flexed. The glass specks in it glittered, and I realized it wasn't glass. It was tiny shells, white and ground to coarse sand. They turn up under clay sometimes, ancient creek beds shoved around by a glacier. When you mix them into the topsoil, water moves differently. Someone had stirred the soil and laid down a layer that would drain fast, then hid it under turf. I pushed my glove into the seam. The turf lifted too easily. The smell that came up was strong enough to change your breath. The rope was not in the chapel now. It was behind me in the earth itself, giving its little pulls to the roots. I stood with my glove in mud and knew the night had narrowed. This was a choice moment. Call Mara and wake Whitaker, then stand on policy. Or pull the turf and look. If I pulled it, I would own whatever I saw. If I didn't, the resort or their contractor or someone else would claim it in the morning light and make it theirs. I removed my glove, hooked my fingers under the turf edge, and lifted. The rectangle was shallow, 2 spades deep. No coffin, no vault. A cavity cut and laid with 1/2-inch PVC that ran toward the fence line and the resort beyond. In the cavity, set at the middle like a relay, was a small box wrapped in shrink film. I had set out to find human mess or animal mischief. I had found a pipe in a package where a grave would go if this were a grave. Water glistened in the pipe mouth. The smell of vinegar and metal came up strong enough to prick my eyes. The bell in the chapel tugged once, a sound light as a breath. I took out my phone and took 3 quick photos. Then I put the turf square back exactly as it had been, pressed the edges in with both hands, and stood with my knees wet. I made a triangle with my light and my breath in the flag. The rain made a fine hiss around us. I felt like the ground might open any time my weight shifted. I went straight to the caretaker house, put the motion puck on the desk, and began the incident report. Writing steadies my hands. When you log in the right order, you borrow authority from the page. Whitaker's ledger sat to my left. I ignored it. The radio sputtered once with weather chatter and then went quiet. I had written the words "unapproved device section D" when the desk phone rang and felt like a wire had found my nerves. It was the resort. A night supervisor with a practiced, soft voice said they had a light fixture issue along the shared wall, and could we confirm that our lights were not shining into their lower cabins. I told him we have fixed lamps and a schedule and nothing moves without a permit. He thanked me with the kind of smile you hear, then mentioned a minor utility check they would conduct at 6:30 sunrise. "On your side or ours?" I asked. "Just confirming our property lines," he said. I put the phone down and stared at the ledger, because staring at the wall would have been more honest. I opened it not for the names, but for the map tucked in the back pocket. A hand-drawn plot map of Section D from the 60s, with neat little squares and lot numbers in pencil. I laid my maintenance notebook alongside and marked where the flag had stood. Someone had erased a square on the old map decades ago, gently, the way you rub a wrong number until it is almost gone but the paper goes thin. The lot number was barely there. The initials JH looked like a shadow when you leaned. The air in the office stayed still while I did it. Too still for an old house. When stillness grows in a place that usually creaks, you feel each breath like it is rented. I took the brass chapel key off my ring and set it on the desk. I wanted to see if the rope question would answer itself once I stopped making it mine. The key clicked against the wood. Down the hall, the floorboards gave 3 slow groans. Not pops, not the random ticks old homes have. The kind of evenly spaced sounds you get when someone walks in measured steps to help their own mind keep pace. I moved to the doorway and put my hand on the jamb. The bell tugged, soft but certain. Climax arrived. Not like a thunderclap, but like a line in a ledger you suddenly realize was written in a different hand. I took both key rings, the maintenance notebook, and the motion puck and went to the chapel. Rain sheeted off the eaves. The rope brushed the wall and held still when I came in, like a cat freezing to gauge how serious you are. The LEDs lagged and then came on with a stutter that showed every grain of dust in the air. I set the puck on the lowest pew, faced it out, and put the brass key on the altar rail. It felt wrong to put a key there, and the wrongness clarified my head. I pulled the crawlspace plate again and lay flat with my shoulder in the gap. The smell rose like breath from below. The crawlspace had a narrow grate cut into the chapel slab toward the front. It was not big. Enough to vent moisture, not a passage. The resonance of the rope was clearer here, vibrating wood close to my ear. I took my light and found the joist that ran in line with the rope. It had a notch cut deep newer wood against old sharper edges. Someone had eased a conduit through the notch and toward the wall. The conduit was tied into a box near the foundation. I traced the box and saw 2 wires leaving, slipping through a crack in the stone into the soil beyond. We do not wire our rope to anything. It is not supposed to sing with electricity. It is supposed to be a rope. I crawled out and stood damp to the ribs. I went outside and moved to the chapel's rear corner where water pooled. My light found the conduit poking from the mortar line as if it had always been there. It ran along the baseboard buried in fresh mortar, then ducked below grade where the soil had that spring. It pointed, true as a rule, toward section D in the pipe. Someone had made a loop that crossed both the bell and the rectangle. It was not amateur. It was the kind of neat work a contractor does when he thinks only his eyes will see. I radioed Mara. "I need you at the chapel," I said. My voice was flat. It is when I am most sure that I forget to change tone. She arrived with her thermos and her boots, leaving damp anchors on the aisle. I showed her the notch, the box, the conduit line. She did not speak for a minute. Then she said, "We had a contractor last month for the motion sensors. The board insisted after the vandalism in May. They sent a young guy with a clean truck and a jacket with their logo. He talked fast. He liked to say we were upgrading experiences. I signed his work order when Whitaker was at lunch because the invoice matched what we had approved." "Did he ask to open the crawl space?" I said. "He said he had to snake a line for the motion ping. I told him the sensors are in the ceiling." He smiled like I was sweet. We both looked at the rope. It did nothing. It didn't need to. "False hope," she said under her breath. "We could cut the line," I said. My hand wanted to pull my multi-tool without asking me. "It's electrical. I would need to pull the right fuse. If I cut blind, I might be the next line in the incident log. Or we could follow it," she said. As if we were back at the yellowed map with the pencil-sketched lots, we followed it. Back at section D, the turf square hit its rectangle as if our hands had never touched it. The flag leaned, patient as an old man. I set the motion puck on the turf and watched its little red light blink twice. It was tuned to notice the kind of movement grass makes when something shifts under it. Not wind. The frequency was different. The puck looked cheap and efficient. "I'll lift," I said, and Mara crouched to hold the flag clear. I raised the turf and exposed the pipe in the wrapped box. The vinegar metal smell made the rain smell like sugar by comparison. Mara took the puck and set it on the edge of the trench. "Time me," she said. "I'm going to unwrap that box, and whatever is inside, we are going to read it, not guess it." I put my light on the pipe. "Careful," I said, though it sounded theatrical in my ears. She peeled shrink film with methodical fingers, no nails to catch. Just the pads like someone used to handling delicate things. Inside was a sealed access port with a sensor collar. If you worked in utilities, you would call it a data logger. If you worked in marketing, you might call it an enhancement node. It had a tiny antenna and a manufacturer code. It had a serial number that would sit on a spreadsheet with 5 more and a note that said pilot. We stared at it with the rain making a dome of sound we could think inside. Cross-property installation, Mara said. Unauthorized. Tied to their utility cabinet just beyond the wall. Feeding their experience. The rope tugs, I said, and hated how admitting it warmed my body like finally saying a fever number out loud. They make them. Maybe, Mara said, too careful to let the night make her a believer in wires alone. Or maybe they tell the rope when the rope is ready to be told. Stop, I said what I meant. I was not ready to multiply this into old stories. Okay, she said. Practical, we log it. We wrap it back. We put the turf back. We stand on it if we must. We call Whitaker at 4. We call the county at 6. We let the resort smile on the phone and we keep our ground. There is a breath the night takes before it changes tempo. We had ours then, we heard boots again. 3 steps, pause. 3 steps, pause. They came not from the road, not from the wall, but from the line under our feet. The conduit's route through soil and joists and walls. The motion puck blinked once, twice, then held steady like a child trying not to be seen. The bell rope in the chapel sounded one soft tug, as if someone in the pews had curled a finger around its tail. Decision, Mara said, because she is good at cutting to the one thing the night demands. I put my hand in the trench. The concrete of the access port was slick. The collar had a tiny toggle, sealed but reachable. I thought of the ledger and the erased square and the letters that looked like other letters in the rain. I thought of Mrs. Patel's wet crescent and Gomez's square prints and how records are the only thing that keep us from being talked over by whoever has the money to pour new paths. Then I flipped the toggle. The chapel bell gave 3 slow tugs, fuller than before. The sound rolled along the joists, took the shape of the aisle and set the dust to quivering. The rope drew a breath against wood and released. The motion puck's light went dark. The rain outside changed in tone, a little heavier, as if the clouds had loosened their throats. We put the wrap back as we found it. We laid the turf and combed the seam with my gloved fingers until it lay like a thought polished smooth by repetition. We put the flag back. We stood up with the slow care you give your spine so your knees can tell the truth later. We walked to the chapel, then did what our hands had wanted to do since 10. We pulled the rope ourselves once firmly. It spoke, not a shout, not a cry, but the sound a house makes when a door is opened for someone you recognize. It settled, breath. We went to the office. We wrote. The incident report said, unapproved device, section D, tied to conduit from chapel crawl space. Motion sensor found under bench. Evidence suggests cross-property data collection. We placed the motion puck on Whitaker's blotter and the brass key beside it. We wrote the serial number for the logger with care. At 3:40, Whitaker answered our second call with a dry cough. You are interrupting a precious sleep, he said. His voice was a shuffle of papers even when he was in bed. Is the property on fire? No, Mara said. But somebody is running a line under our plots and through our chapel to sell their guests a thrill. Board partnership does not include hollowing our ground to make sound effects. Silence, then his breath, then the little tapping he does when he thinks. I will be there at first light, he said. Do nothing until then, nothing. Do not cut a line. Do not pull a device. Do not confront. We already confronted gravity, I said, then took the radio off my collar so he would not hear me exhale. False safety came at 4:20, the darkest edge of morning, when the rain softened and a tiny pushing wind explored the lanes. The lamps haloed and looked like they would keep any promise you asked of them. We sat in the office with the map at our elbows and Mara poured the last of her coffee and made a face like old pennies. We both wanted Dawn to land like a team arriving at shift change, all chatter and certainty. We both knew Dawn only makes things visible. It doesn't fix them. I went once more to the ridge. The resort looked tired the way new things do after their first week when the shine gets a fingerprint. Cabins stood with their decks washed clean. I put my hand on the stone wall and felt it hold steady. The bell tugged 3 times, very soft, like someone practicing not to be noticed. At 6, Whitaker's car headlights burned up the entrance lane. He walked with his coat unbuttoned and his cough tucked into his collar like it was part of his uniform. He is a records clerk at heart, even when he stands on grass. He has a way of patting documents as if they are skittish animals. He came to Section D with us, peered into the trench we reopened, took off his glasses to wipe invisible damp, then put them back. His throat clicked. This is a violation, he said, each word a little square placed on a board. We will do this with paper. We will not do this with wire cutters. He made a call to a county number with a voice that had grown teeth from years of standing in front of counters. He took a photo of the logger's cereal. He asked us 3 times to confirm the direction of the conduit. We told him 3 times. He stared at the chapel like a man looks at a child who has repeated a word he does not want it to know. "I approved sensors," he said softly to himself more than to us. "Not this." By 7, a county truck idled by the curb with a technician who had the alert eyes of someone who expects angry people by default. He was not angry. He was procedural. He checked his meter and found the line live. He traced it with a wand that chirped at each junction. He followed it to the wall and then set his jaw. "The rest is not yours," he said, and looked at Whitaker with a kind of sympathy. "And yours needs a warrant." We rewrapped the trench. The turf settled with a sigh like it had been waiting to lie down. Residents began to arrive with flowers and folded napkins and quiet plans. Mrs. Patel walked in with lilies, the paper crinkling, and her wet crescent smile appeared on the office floor. Gomez left square prints to the shed. Father O'Neill's knuckles cracked like dry bark as he crossed the lane, a habit he never knew he had. Leon stopped his backhoe on the far path and lifted 2 fingers in a salute that stayed 5 degrees past casual. Simple things resumed their right sizes. The resort supervisor called again at 8, his voice softer, more pressed. He asked if our maintenance had disturbed their guests. Whitaker answered with words that would look tidy in minutes. He said partnership and courtesy and jurisdiction until the call ended without resolution. He put the receiver down like it was heavier than when he picked it up. We were back to keys and ledgers. My round book had soil on the corner. Mara's thermos was empty enough to ring when you tapped it. I cleaned my multi-tool and dried the blade with a paper towel. The chapel stood gray and quiet beyond the tree line, ordinary in a way that felt like a lie and a gift. I made one last walk to row C. The aluminum plates wore an even film. The hum had gone, or my ears had shifted to accept it as wind. Slot 14 had no coin now. I took the old dime from my pocket and set it where it had been, sideways so it wouldn't roll. Because superstitions are what you call procedures you can't explain to others. I wiped the plate with my cuff and read the names, then looked away because names deserve privacy from eyes that have learned too much in one night. The county would return with paper. The resort would send a lawyer with a smile. Whitaker would build a folder thick enough to anchor a table. Mara would bring a second thermos. I would walk the ridge. I moved once more past the chapel. The rope hung in its place with its fibers fat from the wet. I put 2 fingers on it and held steady. The rope felt warm, not from my hand, but like it had been handled recently by air, by the room, by the kind of passage that leaves wood smoothed and keys shiny. I turned to leave and then read the little sign above the alcove that I have stepped under 10,000 times without truly seeing. It is a placard placed by a donor in the 1980s, a polite explanation that the bell once signaled ground staff when mourners needed help. I had always thought the last line said, "Please pull gently." It does not. It says, "Please pull only when necessary." I stood in the doorway and watched light gather on the lane. Behind me, from somewhere under the joists, 3 soft tugs spaced themselves with the patience of someone who knows their message will get through. The smell in the aisle shifted from vinegar to old oak. I put the brass key in my palm and felt the bidding, each worn tooth a decision made and remade. Then I did the only necessary thing. I closed the door, turned the lock and listened while the bell finished telling the morning what we had learned in the dark. A hairline crack in the new asphalt ticked as it opened, the faintest fingernail sound in the Sunday heat. The brass nameplate on the chapel door tapped the wood like a loose tooth. Something below the parking lot let out a slow, wet breath, and the bell rope in the vestibule quivered against the plaster arch. I had my hand on the latch and I told myself roads settle. Cemeteries do too. I'm 34 and keep the records for St. Seraphins, an old Creole parish tucked between Esplanade and the river. Not clergy, just a volunteer historian with keys and a stubborn streak. I catalog the stones, cross-check permits, and keep the plot map that looks like a quilt of names. When the church broke open its gravel lot to pour asphalt last week, for safety, Father Duplantier kept saying, I asked to be around. People forget what's under their feet when a surface looks clean. By noon, Mass that morning, the chapel smelled like brine. Not sweat. Not the mildew we fight all summer. This was salt water with a copper bite, like someone had rinsed coins in seawater and hung them to dry. Choir alto Mariah wrinkled her nose mid-hymn and gave me a look. Her hair frizzed against the humidity, a halo gone wrong. The new lot gleamed through the open doors as parishioners drifted out murmuring. I stayed, watching thin blisters rise along a seam where the asphalt met the old brick walk. After we stacked hymnals, I told Father I'd hang back and do a sweep. He coughed into his sleeve, a dry sound that never seemed to go away, and handed me the keys. If the vapor keeps up, crack the gate, he said. Let the air move. The southeast gate clattered open on its chain. Gravel crunched under my boots, that comforting cemetery sound. Predictable, honest. The rows at St. Seraphin's run tight, knee-high borders of stone trimming sandy soil that never drains as fast as it should. Moss for outlines, slab edges. Names repeat in families you could trace by street. Boudreau, Guidry, Leclerc. I cut across to the new stretch along the chapel, past the statue of the Archangel that leans 1/8 of an inch toward the oaks. My maglite bumped my thigh. I stepped up onto the fresh blacktop and crouched. The hairline crack had widened, a dark smile showing gray aggregate. The brine smell came in a gust and I stood too fast, dizzy. There's a ledger I use, a real ledger, paper thick as a prayer card. Its dates reach back to 1841 in a looping hand, then stiff block letters after the war. I took it from the caretaker's office and spread it on the wooden desk by the window that afternoon. The lot expansion had chewed into what old maps called Section D, Line 3, where the parish moved coffins during the 1958 reconfiguration. All remains transferred to crypt beneath chapel, the minute book claimed. Reinterments are supposed to come with paperwork, permits clipped to pages. A man named Hardy had signed off on each. When I ran my finger down the dates in the ledger, one line pulsed at me because it was ordinary and wrong. June 12, 1874. The day the chapel was dedicated. It appeared beside 4 names in Section D. Later in the crypt section, I found the same date beside different names, written by a different hand. It seemed like the parish had buried the dedication day itself on repeat. I took the ledger with me at dusk when the mosquitoes came up in bands. The security lights along the path buzzed into life. Mariah popped by with sweet tea, her nails chipped black and tapping the glass. "You're really going to sit with the dead all night?" she asked, half a laugh. She helps me read inscriptions sometimes, whispering them like lines from a play. "I can stay till the first sweep?" "I want to see if anything moves," I said. That's what the ground does after work. Adjusts, settles, sighs. You listen and you learn if it's done. If it's just the asphalt, we can plan a patch and call it. "Patch it and bless it," she said, crossing herself mid-sip. My grandmother always said the ground by the chapel holds on to rain too hard. We walked rows. I marked fresh heaves with a bit of flagging tape tied to the fence. The new lot sat firm in the sodium glow. The brine smell faded. For a moment, the whole place hummed the low happiness I've always felt in a cemetery after sunset. Quiet loops of names, a rhythm of lives beginning and ending without spectacle. False safety, I realize now, but it felt like a blanket then. We sat on the chapel steps and listened to the slow ticking of heat leaving the roof. Someone on Chartres revved a motorcycle. The sound folded into wind and died. At 9, Gomez, the groundsman whose boots leave square prints, swung by for his last trash run. "Heard the priest say the lot weeps," he said, lifting a bag of wilted carnations. "Asphalt isn't supposed to do that." "Old vault's under there," I said. "If somebody didn't cap something right, you always say if," he said, but not unkindly. "Night, Doc." He calls me Doc because I squint at paper and wear a beanie when it's barely cool. At 10, a soft chime rattled the chapel door again, half a tap, as if someone inside wanted an usher. The bell rope, a fat length of sisal, hung in the vestibule from a hole in the ceiling where the bell frame sits in the little tower. We only ring it on funerals now, mostly for old folks who asked in their wills. I let myself in and stood in the entry. The rope didn't move. I climbed the 6-step iron ladder to peek through the hatch. A short chain held the bell's tongue clear of the bronze. The tower smelled of pigeons and dry metal. No reason for tapping. I slept in the caretaker's little office that night right inside the cemetery wall. The room shares a wall with the chapel and looks out over the older rows. A steel blower leans in the corner. The key cabinet holds tags both new and brass-browned. The ledger stayed open at June 12, 1874. I must have drifted toward midnight with the window cracked, because a thick breath woke me at one. Not wind, not thunder. A ground breath like a door seal releasing underwater. The brine hit again, stronger, and with it a high note like someone running a wet finger around a glass rim. Faint and constant. I got up, pulled on my boots, grabbed the mag light, and stepped out. Sodium light painted the blacktop in crooked gold. The crack had multiplied into a star of narrow seams, each one oozing a damp line down the pitch. I crouched and shined the light. The surface was dry, but vapor shivered above it. The humming came from the chapel wall where a downspout met the buried drain. A trick of resonance, maybe. I walked to the drain and put my hand on the iron grate. It vibrated, a bee under a jar. I could say I considered calling the city. I didn't. What would I say that a church parking lot hummed? I set my ear to the chapel bricks. Behind the wall, the crypt sits under the floor. A long, low room with stacked vaults and a single aisle of poured concrete. I had a key to the side door. The last burial down there had been in the early 80s. Families leave coins on the step now, thinking it's the right place to wish. I let myself in and switched on the fluorescents. They lagged, a slow stutter that made the white tiles along the lower wall look like wet teeth. The brine was heavy here too. My breath threw small clouds. Inside the crypt, sound does strange things. Footsteps slap and come back at you from the stone. The humming tightened to a line as if it knew I was listening. I followed it down the aisle, past niches sealed with marble, names chiseled shallow. Mrs. Thibodeau, 1903. Corinne L. No date, just a dash and an angel. The far end of the crypt holds the section built in '58, where those extra coffins came when they made room in the yard. The seams of these vaults were different, mortar smoother, the marble slightly whiter. The number tags on the corners were brass, not iron. There it was again, June 12, 1874. On a tag where a date never should be, brass stamped with numbers neat as a watch face, screwed into a corner with a slot head whose patina hadn't matched anything else. I raised the light. 4 vaults in that last bank bore the same date on their tags, each at a different level. Someone had made an error and copied the dedication date instead of death. Sloppy, I thought, unsatisfying, but there it was, the ordinary wrongness repeated. I wrote it in my notebook, and the edge of the page went damp where my palm touched it, as if the paper had pulled water from air. The humming pressed my ribs then. It wasn't in my ears. It was in my sternum, in the soft notch above it. I set the mag light down and pressed my palm to the lowest slab with the date. The marble was cold. There is a creak that stone makes when it's stressed, a voice low enough to pass for imagination. The slab gave a whispering pop. Hairline lines chased across its surface like the crazing on old porcelain. I jerked my hand back. That was when the bell rope upstairs moved, because I heard the short rasp of sisal against wood through the ducts. One hitch sound like a breath caught, then 2 more. 3 slow tugs, patient and even. False safety folded like paper. I should have left. I should have locked the door and told Father in the morning we had a problem we couldn't solve alone. Instead, I unlocked the tool cupboard and pulled the grave probe from the hooks. We use it for finding coffin edges. A slender steel rod with a T-handle 2 feet long, the way you feel the earth by inches. In the crypt, the floor is concrete, useless for probing, but the drain at the far corner drops into soil. If water was pooling wrong under the new lot, it could backfill into the crypt if the old connections had been cut. That's one reason you reroute properly. That's also why records matter. Records kept someone honest. I pushed the probe into the drain clean out and felt nothing then a give. The resonance changed against the handle, less a hum now than a string plucked. I eased the rod forward another inch and met a wall that wasn't earth. Wood. Swollen. It flexed like a belly. I swallowed and pulled back. The probe came away wet and slick, and the smell that came up from the clean-out turned from brine to age. A spinal scent of kept cold. I didn't have to name it. My voice wanted to ignore it. I backed away and my shoulder hit the ladder to the tower access. It wasn't a ladder here. It was a narrow stair to an intermediate space where the bell rope dropped. A watch house that hadn't been used since the 70s when a caretaker lived on site full-time. I climbed because motion felt like thinking. The bell rope swung gently as if it moved through air thicker than ours. I put my fingers on it. Felt nothing. 3 slow tugs again, right through the rope I held, not up or down, but in my hands. The pull wasn't mechanical. A current can pass through a line without the line traveling. I let go and it stopped. Outside across the yard, I heard Mariah call my name. It was quiet but clear. I walked back down the crypt aisle and up into the chapel. She stood in the doorway with the security beam behind her, haloed by bugs. "Gomez told me the asphalt's bleeding," she said, not quite joking now. "It's worse." We stood at the lot's edge. The star seam had widened into an off-center cross, and along one limb a split had lifted enough to show compacted base, a pale jaw of crushed limestone. The line ran toward the drain I'd just found swollen wood against. Something beneath the new skin wanted air. Mariah crouched and touched the seam and pulled her finger back. "It's cold," she said. "How is it cold?" "Old vaults act like cisterns," I said, because saying a thing out loud means you believe you can handle it. "If they cut through and capped wrong, pressure builds." "Like a lung," she said, giving the lot a side-eye. "What do we do?" I knew the answer before I admitted it. Pressure relief means you open the right thing before the wrong thing opens itself. If a vault was sending water into the drain path, the only safe place to take the pressure was the crypt, where it could flood by inches up a path you could manage, not by ripping the lot. Manage feels polite now. It felt like a plan. I sent Mariah to get Father. I went back down the crypt stairs with the keys clacking at my belt. The fluorescents hummed and blinked. Condensation gathered along their housings and dripped on the floor in a steady metronome. I set the ledger on the first step and ran my hand along the seam of the lowest slab with the dedication date. Good stoneworkers leave a reveal for a bar. Someone had sealed this tight. If I opened the wrong place, it would break ugly. I paced, counted. 6 plots to the bend of the aisle, 4 up from the drain. The drain had been cut into old lines. Whatever I did, water would move fast. I chose the lowest right-hand vault, the one that hummed whenever I put my palm near it. I slotted the tip of the chisel into the hairline and tapped. The sound that came back was hollow but full, like tapping a drum a room away. My gloved hand slipped on the damp marble. I set my jaw and tapped again. Mortar flaked like powder. The seam eased. A single drop of water swelled at the corner and hung, fat and perfect. I didn't want the first drop. I wanted the first whisper. I set my shoulder against the slab and gave it a hand's width. The old mortared lip released with a sigh, and a thin ribbon of water slid out, clear and cold, cutting a line through the dust. I stepped back. Sometimes a little is enough. It wasn't enough. The ribbon filled to a spill, and beneath it the hum set my teeth on edge. The floor's slope sent the water toward the drain. It carried the ledger smell with it, paper and tannin, as if words themselves had soaked. Father clattered down the stair with Mariah behind him, both breathing hard. "Is this wise?" he asked. Not accusation, but adult concern. "It either comes here now or it breaks the lot," I said. "Here we can move with it." "What if it's not water?" Mariah said, but softer than her usual edge. "Then we still own it," I said. "It's ours." We opened the seam another inch. The room filled with that feeling of a held note, a string drawn back. The slab breathed. We all heard it. Not a ghost sigh or any story sound, a lung under a floor catching up after a long dive. Something inside knocked once, the solid hollow thud of wood bumping stone. Pressure equalized in a long exhale and water poured in a sheet we could step back from. It ran cold over my boots and made my toes numb. Leaves the color of tea flowed in it, and one blackened coin clinked on the floor. The fluorescents picked that moment to flicker harder. Not failure. Condensation had tunneled down the tubes and the contacts hissed. Father reached for the breaker panel by instinct and drew his hand back from a small arc. "We're fine," he said, and he meant it. That was our second false safety. We were there with the problem, and the problem had shape. Then the slab popped 2 inches outward with no human nudge, and the corner of a lid appeared behind it. Wood swollen gray, iron straps strung with pale, webby growth. The date stamped on the brass tag above caught the light. June 12, 1874. Old handwriting. New stamp, we didn't have to say it. The new lot had pressed that vessel into the old drain path. Whoever did the 58 move had set this vault as if it were just a box that could hold weight. A crypt isn't meant to be a structural pile. It's meant to keep company with its own kind. The water slowed as quickly as it had surged. The hum softened until it was only a feeling you noticed if you stopped and waited for your heart. Not stopped, not racing, just doing its job, to measure against it. We reseated the slab as best we could and braced it with the steel T and 2 wedges I fetched from the office. We chalked a warning and left a pan under the worst drip. By 3, the lot had flattened to a shine. The star seam stayed, but the edges dried. I wrote a note for the city about the drain with words careful enough to get them out in daylight. Father put a cone on the worst line and locked the chapel, tapping the brass nameplate once like a pact. We were wet through and smelled like the inside of a ship. I said I'd do one more round. The north row, Leclerc, Boudreau, a pair of Guidry, tilted a few degrees more than last week. I tied bright tape to the fence there too. Mariah hissed at a mosquito and slapped her ankle. I hate that smell, she said, shaking her head. It's not right. Like a storm in a jar. Smells have memories, I said. Sometimes the ground remembers what you taught it. Who taught it salt, she asked, half smiling because she wanted the evening to end in a human place. Maybe the day they blessed it, I said without thinking, because my brain had been snagging on the date all night, that odd repeat. I stopped at the marker at the bend, a little road guide our parents donated when they hyphenated our street for the last time. My name sits on the donor list there, a truth I forget until it's under my fingers. The paint had bubbled where water had stood last week. I touched it and it flaked into my palm. We turned to go. Gravel gave under boots. The world, a cemetery world, which is still a world, was settling after a problem solved as far as it could be before sun. The office smelled like wet paper and Maker's Mark from some long ago Christmas. I woke again near 4, this time to a faint tapping on the office window. Not hard. Beetle taps on plastic vases make that sound. I rose and went to the pane. The parking lot sat square and quiet. The security sensor bathed it in white. No one in sight. I breathed on the glass and wiped a circle. In the smear, something moved at the edge of the cone of light by the chapel steps. Not a person, not an animal. A line darker than blacktop that hadn't been there before. It took a second for scale. It was a mark on the asphalt, precise and tidy as paint, but it wasn't paint. I went out to see with the mag light. Someone had laid a strip of coins along the seam at the chapel step. Pennies mostly, some black with old lacquer, a few showing wheatbacks. There was no one to make that offering. We collect stray coins in a jar near the sacristy, and sometimes Father gives them to the poor box. My light bounced off the pennies and made a river out of metal. I bent closer. Every coin I could read carried the same date. Not all of them the same year. Coins lie. But wherever a readable date showed itself under the film of brine, it had frozen on 1874. Maybe the grime played tricks. Maybe numbers are suggestion-prone at 4 a.m. I blinked and looked again. 1874. 1874. 1874. The seam trembled under my feet. A breath you could pretend was a tired building if you wanted to sleep later. I gathered a handful of the coins and put them in my pocket. They were cold enough to burn the skin beneath my thigh. When I went back inside, the ledger page I'd left open had bled at the edges until the ink feathered like hair. The entry for June 12th had seeped into the next line, and the next the two becoming a little wave. I closed the book and set a box fan to kiss it dry. Dawn came in gray strips across the stones. Father walked the lot and didn't say anything at first. Then he nodded once and went to call the contractor from his office phone, because he doesn't trust cell towers at the edges of holy places. Mariah went home to sleep and texted me a photo of a nickel left on her dashboard that she swore she hadn't put there. Gomez lined the cones like chess. I stood with my hands in my pockets, feeling the coins warm to body temperature, and thought about the little bank of vaults under the crypt steps where the dedication date kept repeating like a tune you can't shake. The city came with a crew by 8. The foreman, a woman named Cheney who wore her vest half unzipped and kept a short pencil behind her ear, crouched at the seam and frowned. "We'll core it," she said. "Find the voids. Patch and seal." "There's a crypt below that's carrying water," I said. "Don't pump anything without letting me reroute the drain." She nodded once like she'd heard the stubborn tone before. "You do your church thing," she said. "We'll do ours." They set the rig. We marked the drain and I took a crescent wrench to the cleanout and cracked it with a careful turn. The humming had dropped to a thrum, sleepy and regular as a cat. When the core barrel bit into the new lot, the bell rope upstairs ticked against its channel, small and steady, as if it could feel the vibration of a cylinder through 1,000 quiet bodies. This is the part I don't gild. The core pulled up a puck of asphalt with a hole dissolved through its center, and water a degree colder than the morning poured through, clear as truth. It smelled of coins and wood. In it floated 3 smears of leaf, a scrap of ribbon curled like a minnow, and the very smallest corner of paper soft as a moth wing. Cheney swore and stepped back. "Void," she said into her radio. We got a live one. We spent an hour setting a temporary sleeve so nothing else would collapse. By the time we were done, the lot looked ordinary again. People like ordinary. Ordinary lets them go buy bread and talk weather. It was safer, and we all wanted that. But nothing about it was done. Water is patient, and dates are too. I collected the coins I'd pocketed and lined them on the ledger when the office was empty for lunch. I looked at them not as signs but as objects. Not magic. Not story props. Stamped metal with corrosion where fingers had rubbed. If you held them at angle, the light would choose its own year. If you turned them flat, 1874 sat there like a thumbprint. I pulled a pencil and made a sharp note beside the ledger entry. Dedication date shows on tags, coins, and breath. And then struck the last word because you can't write breath as a finding and keep your credibility and the trust I've earned with families. We held the gate open that afternoon. People stopped by because any orange cone draws a crowd in a neighborhood where everyone is a cousin by half. Mrs. Boudreau wore a scarf with blue birds and told me she remembered the old gravel lot. Mr. Leclerc laughed through his nose the way he does when he's out of cigarettes and asked if the city would pave twice. Tasha from maintenance checked the sink trap in the sacristy because she said the pipes were tasting like pennies. I wrote their comments into a pad because oral histories matter. They help later when the facts start to feel like jokes. That evening, when the last city truck left and the crew gathered their cores into a pile like thick black coasters, Father stood in the vestibule with his hand on the bell rope. He didn't pull, he waited. "I will say a thing," he said to me, not moving his hand. "I don't believe it fixes anything. I believe it names it." "Names are helpful," I said, because words make a way to move. "This ground has a date stuck in its teeth," he said. "We will keep picking it out until it stops cutting the tongue." We locked up. I sat with the ledger at the office desk and traced the loops of that old 1874 entry with a pencil eraser, not to erase, but to feel the indentation under the ink. The room smelled not just of brine now, but of iron heated once and cooled. I closed the book and set it on its edge to dry the spine properly. Right before full dark, I walked the yard one last time. The security lights clicked into life. The gravel sounded honest. The new lot held its shape. At the edge of the chapel steps, someone had placed a single brass key, not one of ours, older and dull with use. It had a simple oval bow and teeth worn almost smooth. I picked it up and felt the past touch my palm like a cat threading a leg. The key had been tagged with a paper slip tied through the bow. The slip was soaked and printed in ballpoint. The numbers were plain. June 12, 1874. The ink hadn't run. I left the key on the ledger that night and locked the office. I slept on the cot with my boots by the door and the rope tapped once before I drifted, like a spoon against china. You want a last moment that says what a place becomes after you've seen it like this? Here is mine. This morning, after the crew left and the cones came up and the gate was unlocked for the first funeral since we opened the lot, I walked the row to meet the family and guide them to plot F6. The sky was clean and the air was a little sweeter, rain scrubbed. We paused by the bend where the guide marker is, where my name sits on the donor plate. A new temporary marker stood on the grass 2 plots over. White corrugated plastic, the kind the funeral home slides into a frame until the stone is set. The ink on it was still glossy. The name was one I knew, a relative of the Leclercs, and below it, clear as any sheaf of paper could make it, the date of burial read June 12th, not the year we were standing in. The old one, the dedication day. A breeze slipped up from the river. The lot, the new lot we'd capped and cored and sleeved, made a sound I could pretend was nothing. The quietest friction of aggregate against aggregate, a settling like someone making room at a pew. The bell rope didn't move. The brass nameplate on the chapel door didn't tap. Only the little paper date wavered in its frame and snapped back flat. I went back to the office in that small silence and flipped the ledger to June. There in the margin, where my pencil had never gone, a faint indentation mirrored the old hand as if something under the paper had pressed up. The number 12 sat there in the veil of paper's memory, round and patient. I closed the book and set the coins in a jar. If anyone asks why I keep them, I tell the truth. I sort dates for a living. Some dates sort you back.